So good morning. The 3-minute out warning. We're about 3 minutes from getting started.
Get our donut now.
Get your donut, Kathleen. Get it going.
Good luck. You look handsome.
Oh, thank you.
Try to keep us on track.
We'll do my best.
I know you will.
It's already scripted. How can you screw this up, right?
And it looks like a little better turnout this year.
Yeah, we did a little bit more PR, marketing, tried some different things this year, and looks like we got a better turnout. So.
A little better, so that's good.
I think more people are curious about this issue and with all that's happened, the ballot initiative and all the changes, and so we got more people coming out. This is what we wanted all along.
This is
Open the conversation. So we'll see how it goes.
That's exactly what we're looking for.
Yep.
All right. I'm here to, cause problems and no.
You're here to cause problems? Okay. Amanda, how are you? You were going to be late. Fast forward. It's nasty kind of rain now, right? It is. This is like, what's going on? Yeah, I had to get Sean to school. It's being live streamed. I'll show everybody how to get to it. In a minute here, I'll get everybody to speak on how to keep reminding. It's at aqfairbanks.com website. Just click on it. Go there, there's a link to it. And yeah, if it's not working, please let us know immediately. I'm going to test it through a couple different ways once it starts. If somebody finds an issue, let me know so I can see if I can fix it.
Well, I kind of either. Hi, Amanda. Good morning.
So Commissioner Harding is here, right?
Yep. Yep. Yes, he's here. You get to just step on.
Okay. Him over there. That's Commissioner Harding over there.
This lab is the gentleman taller.
Over here.
Yeah.
Oh, Hamlin's here. That's all.
Okay, so I guess Kristen is not here today.
All right, good morning, campers. We're going to start in exactly 1 minute. 1 minute out. We have the link posted for the web streaming?
Nope.
Okay, I'm taking care of it.
You got it?
So we got
Where are we going to put it?
yeah.
Where's the link at?
Yes, I just to Sean and then
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third annual Clear the Air Conference. I see people making their way to their seats. We're going to kick things off here. Everybody's catching up. A lot of good friendships. I see that. Thank you. Hey, we got a pretty packed schedule today and tomorrow, so if it feels like I'm driving you guys, I am. So I don't apologize for that. My name is Jim Williams. I'm Carl Castle's Chief of Staff, so welcome. If you're new to Fairbanks or have never been to Fairbanks, welcome to Fairbanks. It's a wonderful town. I've raised my family here, and I know I see a lot of familiar faces in here I've seen from many, many years. Real quick, I want to kick this over to Mayor Castle in just a couple minutes, but before we get started, I got to deal with some housekeeping issues. But before I even do that, I want to start rounding up some key folks. Commissioner Hartig, are you here? Maybe you're going to have a couple words to say. EPA Administrator Lattic, you're here. He's out there. Director Hamlin, I see him. And then Ken Wagner, EPA, Washington, D.C., is in the house. So say hi, Ken. Thank you for coming all the way from Washington, D.C. Some housekeeping. Restrooms. Back in the back, if you haven't seen them, they're in the back there. There's another set of restrooms down the hall to the right from my perspective and down to the left a little bit. Safety. If something happens and we need to get out of this building, what we're going to do is we're going to go out this door, that door, or that door. If you go out this door, make your way out to the parking lot and across the parking lot into that driveway. If you go out this door, you can go around to the right and out another set of doors and make your way around the building to the parking lot. And if you go out this door, there's some French doors on the right, make your way around, and everybody assemble in the parking lot, okay? Because it's raining, staff, Glenn, Todd, Nick, Brittany, some of my staff, grab all the umbrellas in the little pile there if we have to get out, so we're gonna need those. But I'm not anticipating an incident, but if we have one, everybody knows what to do, right? Okay. You can stand in the woodshed. Okay, thank you, Todd. Cell phones. So if you have a cell phone, out of respect, please put it on silent. And I know folks are going to be checking their emails and looking at other things, but just put them on silent. We got a pretty heavy schedule. We want to get through that without any interruptions today. If you're coming and going and you want to watch this on live stream, we do have a live stream. Thanks to AUP in the back for setting that up for us. You can go to a couple different, about three different sources to get to that on our Facebook page. You can go to our main borough webpage, and then pretty quickly here, it's going to be on the aqfairbanks.com website. We just checked, it wasn't there, but we're fixing it right now. So presentations, if you want a copy of the presentations we're going to show, they're going to be on the aqfairbanks.com website. We'll post them pretty quickly after the presentations are done. So if you need a copy of it or you want to see it, just go to that site and download it real quick. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mayor Castle, Fairbanks North Star Borough Mayor.
Thanks, Jim. One quick correction. He said he was my chief of staff. He's the borough's chief of staff. He always says mayors, We're all in this for the whole community, and thank you for being here today. This is our third Clear the Air conference, and we're really glad to do it. We've been listening to the comments previously from the first 2 years. We've adjusted a few things for this weekend. It is a jam-packed schedule we've tried to create more diversity of opinion, more positions, so that qualifier you see in the newspaper all the time, the things you hear may not necessarily be reflecting the opinion of anyone else in the room or whatever. We're trying to show the complexity of the issue and the challenges in finding solutions for our air quality in our community. I think we all agree on the importance of finding solutions, but there's a lot of paths to get there and a lot of different things that might disguise themselves or present themselves as possible solutions. So thank you for being here and being engaged and interested in this. It's huge. We do have lots of empty chairs, so text your friends and say, hey, I'm learning good stuff over here. Come on down, and they even have free food. That'll get them here for sure. So we do have more space. Let's get more folks here so that we can get the whole community engaged in working in the right direction, or something, at least some common ground we can find. Huge kudos to everybody involved in putting this on. I think we have more diversity behind the scenes this year than we've ever had, with more people here from the EPA. Thank you for being very well represented, coast to coast represented. This is the first time for that from EPA. So I think that shows the magnitude of the problem. When Washington, D.C. is coming here to look at what's going on, thank you, Ken, we know that we've got something pretty challenging in front of us. I think we have more folks from DEC here also statewide, Juneau, Anchorage, and local, than we've had previously for this. So chat with them if you have questions in between sessions. We do have some challenges in staying on schedule, so Jim is going to be whip driving you. I'm not going to moderate all weekend like I have the previous couple of years. He has a bigger whip than I do, so and it's a larger mission this year to try to keep us on schedule. Thanks to the borough's air quality division working on this too. Quite a bit has gone into it. Mother Nature isn't cooperating with this rain for our wood burning demonstration, but we have that on the schedule a couple different places, and I think you'll find that very interesting. We've been trying to put that together the previous 2 years unsuccessfully. This year we got it all put together, and now Mother Nature's raining on our parade. But hopefully we'll get a break in the weather. And our air quality division isn't overly staffed, and so the folks that do work there have been pushing real hard. We've tried to search throughout our borough organization and provide support from other departments as the workload peaks for them, and they can't keep up. It's put a burden on our whole organization, even the mayor's office. Kudos to the staff in my office for stepping up and helping out in a number of different ways. Some of them here today, some holding the fort down in the office back on the 3rd floor of the borough building. But I think the biggest kudo this year once again goes to Lenine Livingston, who has really been dumped on. She's from the mayor's office, and she's coordinated the previous couple sessions. Did she run away, or she's hiding? Here, right here behind me, trying to fix any little details that are slipping through the cracks as we go forward. But because we're kind of limited on staff, this year she hasn't had the support that she's had previously from other staff around our organization. A little more is dumped onto her shoulders, but she's up to the task, and you can see from our wonderful facility here and whatnot that we're going to have a good event. So thank you for coming. I very much appreciate this. I think most of you know that I'm not going to be around much longer in this capacity, a couple more weeks, 10 days, and there's an election. That's the first door closing on me, but that doesn't make this issue go away. And I can appreciate the serious nature and the difficulties in getting us where we need to go. But we got to work together to get there. It's going to take this whole community to get us there. So put your shoulder into it. Let's really see what kind of a team we can build. I think we're getting stronger. The stakeholders group, the leadership from Brian Rogers, and the diversity in that group is treading into new ground and coming up with questions, ideas from all parts of our community. We want to listen to anyone and everyone and pull you on board to help be part of the solution. We got to do it together. So thanks and welcome.
So Commissioner Hartig, you have a few minutes. Thank you.
Well, it's good to be back in Fairbanks. I was here at the last conference. I like coming up this time of year because I was telling Carl it immunizes me for winter. You come up from Anchorage, you get that first dose of frost, and you go home, and a couple weeks later it's the same in Anchorage. And I come up here, the flowers are blooming and it's warm, and I don't know what's wrong, but it's still nice. Always great to be a great group of people here. And I really do appreciate DEC being able to participate in this conference. As you probably know, our mission is primarily to protect the environment, but also human health. And that there's probably no more serious human health issue in our department right now than the PM 2.5. We have been putting an incredible amount of resources over the last 10 years to try to help solve this issue. We were just talking out in the hallway a minute ago and just roughly calculating that we're into this over $10 million, the state contribution at this point. And to give you some idea, in our department, in our air quality division, which is our smallest division in DEC, and DEC is a small agency in state government, you know, we're about 0.3%, or about a third of 1% of the state unrestricted general fund budget. You know, that's how small we are. And then you put air quality, the smallest office in that. And look at some of the issues they got on their plate. Like right now, we've got cruise ships in Juneau and the local people concerned about the air emissions from those stacks and the cumulative impacts and what the carrying capacity in Juneau is, you know, of the tourism traffic that they're seeing. We see development on the North Slope, you know, proposed development in Anwar, and air quality issues there and cumulative impact concerns that the borough and the residents are raising up there. They want help from us on. We got back from both the municipality of Anchorage and the borough up here, we got their air monitoring programs back this last year and had to absorb those in our budget. And then also in the villages, we have next summer plans for dust control projects, experimental projects out there to try to deal with health issues in the villages. And we have to do the monitoring associated with that. So as we were trying to tackle this problem here and putting significant resources to it, there's a lot of other issues around the state that are swirling around that need our attention too. In that same period of time, or less, only in the last 5 years, we've seen a 34% decline in unrestricted general fund. So it's really hard to keep up on things. You can imagine with the challenge that we have with the resources that we have in meeting your needs here. But we're committed to doing it. We're going to do the best job we can, and we know that the way we're going to be successful is through collaboration, and that's collaboration with the borough and your air quality division, which has been excellent to work with, and the mayor's office, the assembly, all excellent to work with. It's also getting the cooperation of EPA, and I really thank Chris Lattic and Ken Wagner for being here. Ken, as you may know, he's our direct contact to the EPA administrator. He's the liaison between the states and the EPA administrator. And so when we talked about trying to get him up here to see why Alaska is different, not just in terms of the air quality issues here in Fairbanks, but how we provide water and sewer to rural Alaska and all sorts of other things, we're going to take him around the state and show him on his short trip here. We were at the top of that list again was Fairbanks. He had to come see Fairbanks. He had to come hear from the people in Fairbanks what the situation on the ground as we try to tackle this issue, what that issue really means to the people here. The other big challenge we have is timing. You know, we've been at this 10 years, and almost 10 years from the time that there was original non-attainment designation, and that's the time that you get under the Clean Air Act to get the fix in place. And so we're close, very close. You'll hear more about timing, but it's another factor that we can't ignore. You know, there's resources, there's collaboration, there's working with the local people, and there's timing. And we don't have the luxury of all the time that we might want to take to reach a conclusion here that works. So with that, we'll roll up our sleeves and work together on finding that solution. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to participate.
So I need to step back just a little bit. I didn't give Commissioner Hartig the respectful introduction that he deserved, so I'm going to put this in perspective. Just so folks know, this is Commissioner Larry Hartig from the state of Alaska. He works under the Governor Walker administration, and the commissioner has a very wide and breadth of experience in environmental issues. He was an attorney practicing in Anchorage doing environmental work since the early 1980s, and then he was appointed into the administration of the state of Alaska in 2007. So Commissioner, thank you for the introduction. We appreciate it. So our next person to come up is Administrator Chris Lattic, excuse me. He serves as the regional administrator for the Pacific Northwest and Alaska region, and his responsibilities include overseeing the environmental protection efforts for the states of Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, including 271 tribal governments. Mr. Lattic served as commissioner of the Alaska Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development from 2015 to 2017, where he worked to protect consumers while building a strong economy and healthy communities. During his tenure, he oversaw approximately 500 employees in 6 divisions and 7 agencies. He previously served as a city manager in Alaska for 14 years, where he was responsible for the day-to-day operations of city services and programs and long-term planning goals for the city. Earlier in his career, Mr. Lattic served as a city manager in Dillingham, Alaska, and the city manager and public works director in Galena, Alaska. His passion for protecting the environment extends to his involvement in other organizations such as the Alaska Arctic Policy Commission, Northwest Waters Task Force, and serving on the working group on the Arctic Marine Protected Areas and the Task Force for Arctic Marine Cooperation. Mr. Lattic holds a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Biology from Eastern Illinois University, and he also attended or studied geology and engineering at Fort Lewis College, University of Colorado. Please join me in welcoming EPA Region 10 Administrator Chris Lattic.
Good morning. It is good to be back in Fairbanks. As the individual here said, the Chief of Staff mentioned, I was the Commissioner of Commerce. I've been to Fairbanks many times over the years for different meetings, and it's good to be back. And I want to thank Mayor Castle for putting this together and inviting the EPA to come, as well as DEC. Larry and I have worked together for many years. In a past life, I had to get permits from Larry. And then we became peers working in the cabinet together for the governor. And it's been a long relationship and a good relationship, and we worked together really well. And so I always appreciate Larry's approach to things. It's very pragmatic, very similar to mine, and just likes to get things done. So I wanted to come to here today because I believe that you need to have boots on the ground to truly understand an issue. I've been on this job for 10 months, and in those 10 months, my boots haven't stopped moving. I have traveled extensively in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, and I haven't gotten to Alaska as much as I want to, but I hope to rectify that. As you know, I spent 25 years in the state as a city manager in Galena, Dillingham, and in Alaska, and I understand how local governments work, and I am a firm believer that it does work. I wanted to come here today to acknowledge the work that's been done by the borough and the state and community members, because without the community members, local government doesn't work. What the borough is doing is working, and the efforts are beginning to pay off in better air quality. We have been working together for 10 years, as Larry said, with the state, the borough, and community to clean the air in Fairbanks. Improvements are being made, but there's still plenty left to do. And I know that you have a packed agenda and are talking about all the various options of what some of the things are that you can do. Having lived in Galena, I know what it's like when the temperature drops to 80 below. And typically the temperature is another 15 degrees colder than Fairbanks out in Galena. So you don't hold the record, all the records. And I understand how during those times when there's a temperature inversion, what happens to the wood smoke. And we know that the problem is wood smoke, and I believe that the best solutions are going to come from this community. We are here to support your efforts to that end. We have seen other communities come together and meet similar challenges, and we know Fairbanks can do it too. I also want to acknowledge the unique characteristics of Fairbanks due to the extreme cold and the inversions that many folks in Washington, D.C. don't understand and don't have a clue. So I think that we all can agree that we need to continue to work together to find solutions to this problem. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tim Hamlin to talk a little bit more about some of the technical issues and some possible ways forward. But I really appreciate all of you folks coming here today on a Friday morning, and to Mayor Castle, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So as Tim's making his way up to the podium, I do have some bio information on him. So I will keep it short, Tim. Tim Hamlin is the EPA Office of Air and Waste Director. Tim became the director, and we've worked very, very closely with Tim in the mayor's office over the last couple of years, so we know him pretty well. Tim became the director of the Office of Air and Waste for the EPA Region 10 in 2016. Prior to that, he served for 7 years as the associate director of the Office of Management Programs. Earlier in his 25-year EPA career, Tim served in a number of supervisory positions and served as an assistant regional counsel. He graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State University with a BA in history and earned his law degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and clerked for Chief Justice Warren Matthews of the Alaska Supreme Court. Please welcome Tim Hamlin.
Thanks, Jim. Well, good morning, everyone. I got the introduction, so I'm going to skip over that particular talking point. I do want to thank the Borough and Mayor Castle for inviting us to participate in this conference. It's my third time at the conference. I was on the job like 2 months when I came up here the first time. It's something I really look forward to coming because I think we have developed a very collaborative and constructive working relationship. I want you to know that that definitely doesn't mean, you know, what EPA says is what the borough does. It's a much more rich dialogue than that, I can assure you. But as you know, there is a very serious air quality challenge here in Fairbanks. Fairbanks was originally designated non-attainment in 2009, so we're approaching the 10-year mark for being in non-attainment. I am truly heartened by the substantial progress that's been made to improve air quality. I appreciate the hard work of the borough, Mayor Castle, and many others in the community to bring about those improvements. And the convening of the air quality stakeholders groups. I just met Brian Rogers this morning. Nice to meet you, sir. Convening that group to develop a more rigorous plan to achieve attainment is another reason why I think we can be optimistic about where we're headed. All that said, I do feel obliged to share my concern that while things are headed in the right direction, as Commissioner Hartig pointed out, time is short, and the effort to improve air quality must move forward with urgency and greater rigor. So this is a big, it's an important time in the history of this effort, and frankly, I wish we were farther along, but we are where we are. Things are developing in the way that that is good and can get us where we need to go, but we're going to need to move quickly. So the reason we have to move quickly is the community is still about 2.5 times above the standard in North Pole in particular, and that's the hard nut of the problem we have to solve. As I say, this community is now in serious non-attainment, and the time frames and the requirements are just become more difficult to meet as we go. I also want to emphasize why reducing fine particles is so important, and I know you're going to have some other speakers addressing this shortly, but I always feel like it's important for us to emphasize, those of us trying to develop these plans, to emphasize that there's serious health effects from breathing fine particles. They penetrate deep into the lungs and can even pass into the bloodstream. And the health consequences that happen as a result of that are pretty serious. Decreased lung function, increased and worsening asthma, other respiratory symptoms, chronic bronchitis, heart irregularities, heart attacks, and even premature death. We're not messing around with something inconsequential here. The bottom line is fine particles at the levels experienced here in the borough are very harmful to public health, and that's the problem we need to solve. I also want to talk about EPA's role in solving this problem. Congress gave EPA a mandate, establish national ambient air quality standards to protect human health and ensure all population areas meet the standards. EPA must ensure the state and the borough successfully implement programs to guarantee that every citizen in the borough, in the Fairbanks non-attainment area, has clean air to breathe. And EPA is continuing to support the work of the state and the borough and the community by sharing best practices, giving technical support, and providing substantial funding for air quality programs. I think we're well over $6 million in targeted airshed grants at this point. So while it's ultimately EPA's legal duty to make sure that the problem is solved, we believe, as everyone before me has said, and I heartily agree, that local solutions work best. And we start with the local air agency. We're encouraged to see stakeholders are working with the borough and that the entire community is engaged in seeking solutions. Today's conference is a great example of this community-based approach. The local government and community approach has been successful in other places where we've been involved. Tacoma, Washington, Klamath Falls and Oak Ridge, Oregon, and West Silver Valley, Idaho. We are eager to see the air quality plan that the borough and the state are developing with community input to implement pollution control measures that will reduce particle levels to meet the health standard. Collectively, the EPA, the state, and the borough have done a lot of work to figure out the sources of pollution contributing to the violation of the standard. Assessing all available information, we know that wood smoke is the biggest source. It contributes about 75% of the particles we are concerned about, and again, that's with the North Pole point of emphasis. So while other sources that emit fine particles must also contribute to the solution, there is no doubt that control measures for wood smoke are absolutely necessary to meet the standard. And that is why the borough is implementing a curtailment program. We understand curtailment programs are not popular. We also know they're both necessary and effective. And the problem you have here in the borough, curtailment programs help solve. We believe a critical component to solving the air quality problem here in the borough is also is not only to implement the curtailment program, but also to provide incentives for the use of cleaner sources of heat. And cooperation by everyone in the community is key to a successful program, and everyone must do their fair share. We're also, I want to make sure you understand, we're also open to new technologies like electrostatic precipitators. But there needs to be evidence, strong evidence, that those wood stove retrofits, that their long-term performance, their durability, and their safety are all assured. Unless we know that such devices can bring emissions down to levels that are similar to those from oil-burning furnaces, please don't count on being able to use wood stoves in the winter. Well, during inversions. I know the two overlap quite a bit, but there you go. And also, just returning to my comments earlier, it's critical to pick up the pace. We need a plan, we need it soon, and we need to see it's working. It's been nearly a decade, and it's time to get serious about getting all the way back to air quality. I think we can all agree everyone deserves clean, healthy air, and it's beyond argument that on those very cold days, heat is a necessity. My staff and I are here to share information, to listen, to answer your questions, and we'll be here the next few days to do that. A couple of folks who are with me, I don't see Justin Spinello. Oh, there you are, Justin. Hi, you moved. Justin Spinello and Dan Brown work for me in the Office of Air and Waste in Seattle, and I obviously work for Chris, and glad Chris and Ken could join us. We're here for you, and we're working with the borough and ADEC to try and figure out how to get to where we all need to go. I don't think we're taking questions at this time, but I will be on a panel this afternoon to answer your questions, and Dan will be presenting more information tomorrow and answering questions as well. So with that, again, I'd like to thank you for your participation today, and thank you, Mayor Castle, for the invitation to come, and we welcome the opportunity to engage with you to address this very challenging problem, and I'm confident that working together, we can get where we need to go. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Commissioner Hardig and Administrator Lattic and Ken Wagner. Thank you for coming all the way from Washington, D.C. That really does show that folks outside our community, decision makers outside of our community, are listening and really care about Fairbanks. So we do appreciate it. Real quick, you guys are doing really good. We're executing this with military precision and timing, so I do appreciate that. I do have one person I want to recognize. Assemblymember Christopher Quist has joined us. If you want to raise your hand and be recognized, Chris, there he is in the back of the room. Okay, real quick. So we're moving on to our first presentation. So Wendy, if you want to start making your way up, and I'll introduce you real quick here. Okay. So Wendy has a bio here, so I'm going to read a brief bio on Wendy. So Wendy's a longtime resident of North Pole, so we're neighbors, and is an active member of the Fairbanks North Star Borough Wood Burners Group. She's a wife and mother of 5 who believes in open communication, fairness, and compromise. I think we can all agree to that. Please join me in a hearty Fairbanks welcome for Wendy Mannon. I'm going to tee up your slides.
Great, because I need to have that.
Yep, we're going to click that, and we're going to start you off here. Okay.
All right, so when I want to press the slide, I just
that one right there.
a little arrow there. Okay. That one there. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy to be here. I haven't practiced public speaking since I was made to do so in high school, so this is going to be very nerve-wracking, and I hope I don't muck it up. So, I have been in Alaska for 25 years. My family came up here when I was a kid. My dad was in the Army, and we came up here in '89. My dad retired here, and we moved out to Salcha, where we had some property, and we had some animals. We raised cows and chickens and pigs. We had a wood stove. I learned what it was like to really be self-sufficient. We did everything that we could. We raised our animals. We slaughtered our own animals. We had a garden. We did everything. There are 3 total children, so my mom and dad and myself and 2 others. So it was kind of a large family, but we managed to make it through being self-sufficient and knowing that those things that we were doing and relied on would help us out through the winter or lean times. I am a wife of 19 years. I am a mother of 5 children. A mother of 5 children on a single income, so I'm a stay-at-home mom. I know very well the struggles there are to be had in a tight budget. I know how hard it is to pinch pennies and to try to get your budget to stretch and to cover the things that are needed. Being from a military family, I don't think people have to understand what it's like to be raised in the military to sort of appreciate that. We were raised to be respectful. I always said yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, no, ma'am, and no, sir. I still do to this day. I was also raised that whenever you felt or saw that something was wrong or something needed to be changed, that you needed to step up and change those things. I feel very strongly that there are problems with the air quality program and they need to be changed. So that's why I've stepped up here. My presentation is on expectation versus reality and the way that the borough and other people who are making rules believe that they should be implemented and how they should go, and the way that things actually happened and how they move forward. There's a plan. It's supposed to be smooth sailing. It's supposed to be easy. And the actual reality is that it's not smooth sailing. It's not easy. There are pitfalls and walls to be climbed over and very difficult challenges that have to be overcome. I believe the borough thought that there was going to be some pushback. Obviously, we know that these rules are difficult and people aren't going to like them, but I don't think that the borough thought that the pushback was going to be as hard as it was. The wood-burning community were not happy with the rules, and they let the borough know that they weren't happy with the rules. There was a 20% compliance rate with the no burn bans. Some of the data marks it a bit higher than that, but that's because the sample size was small. Because of the way that the rules were implemented with sort of lack of wood burners being invited to have a say at the table, that led to sort of a bit of contention between parts of the community that I don't believe should have happened. I believe truly that the wood burners should be responsible and they should be held to a high standard. They should have good operating devices. They should operate them in the manner that is best for the efficiency of the stove and for getting as clean emissions as possible out of the wood stoves. There's no question that wood burners should be held accountable and should be punished whenever they are doing the wrong thing. But we sort of have this problem where people aren't actually talking to each other. They're not understanding each other. They're sort of talking at each other. And there is a lack of people looking each other in the eye and understanding that you have a problem and I have a problem and we need to meet in the middle. We have to realize, everybody has to realize that both sides, the people who are hurting with the air problems and the people who want to burn their home or burn wood economically, they both have valid concerns and they both need to have an equal voice whenever these types of rules and regulations are being talked about and implemented. And I firmly believe that wood burners have not had an equal representation and an equal voice at the table. The other side is not the enemy. People who want to have clean air is not the enemy. People who want to burn wood to stay warm, they are not the enemy. They're just people who want to be warm, and they're just people who want to breathe clean air. We should not be okay as a community, as a government entity, for sacrificing one to get the other. We should not be okay with forcing people to stop burning wood in order to get clean air. And we should not be okay with the people who have problems with the air being okay with wood burners burning irresponsibly. This should not be a case of one side winning and one side losing. There aren't sides. We're just people trying to get by the best that we can. And in this Arctic environment, it's a very difficult challenge. We live in the coldest city in the United States. Everybody knows that. It's made the news. We're the coldest. Fairbanks is the coldest. It's not a surprise when the temperatures get to negative 40 degrees. Most people in this room, or most people that's lived in Alaska, know that, and they come to expect it. When it gets to negative 50, people are starting to get a little uneasy and eyebrows are getting raised. When it gets to negative 60, people are stunned. I've been here long enough. I've been through temperatures where it's been 60 degrees, negative 60 degrees for weeks on end. Living out in Salcha, it was colder in Salcha than it was anywhere else, and we had a wood stove, and we were safe and secure in the knowledge that our house wasn't going to get hurt, and we wouldn't have to hurt the family budget in order to stay warm when it was that cold for that long. There weren't burn bans then, but knowing that you weren't going to over-budget yourself to stay warm, even at those times, it's a security that can't be overlooked. Here in the interior, wood heat saves lives. It is not a matter of convenience. It isn't a matter of liking the smell of the wood smoke or liking the ambiance of your fire on a cold afternoon. It's a matter of grave importance to have the ability to heat your home when there are extreme temperatures. The amount of energy it takes to heat your home over a long period of time with regular fuel oil or other sources is extensive. And the rules that are in place, or at least our extreme temperatures, the other places that have these burn bans and air quality things, their temperatures are a balmy day compared to our temperatures. There's no comparison to other communities that have had wood smoke curtailment programs and their temperatures. Their temperatures cannot even come close to comparing to our negative degree temperatures and our extreme cold weather. There is no law, there is no regulation that can be implemented anywhere that would actually prevent a wood burner from burning wood in their home when it is negative 60 degrees, and that is what they have to heat their home with. That cannot be understated. A person who has a stove and who has wood is going to burn their wood to stay warm, especially when we're getting into temperatures of negative 40 and colder. That's an absolute necessity, and I really urge people who don't live here to try to understand that concept. Those temperatures are dangerous, and people are going to stay warm. The borough instituted ways to allow yourself to get a waiver to burn during stage 1 waivers, or stage 1 burn restrictions and stage 2 burn restrictions. The waivers, I think, could have done a really good job and could have helped out a lot. You have to register your stove. It has to be EPA compliant. It has to have the emission standards of the EPA. You have to take a test. You have to prove that you are proficient at burning wood and you know how to use your stove properly, and you know what is the best way to get the best heat and the least amount of emissions. These are good things to know. Every wood burner should already know that before they start burning, but this is a great way to make sure that they are educated and to continue to burn responsibly. But on the other side of that, if you register your stove, the borough now knows where you are and what stove you have. And with the current rules in place for smoke control and punitive measures, people are hesitant to sign these waivers because they don't want to have a target placed on their home and their back if in an event they have run out of fuel and they must burn in a burn ban, or they must burn and they're told not to. Because if you have a stage 1 waiver, you can't burn during stage 2 burn bans. So this is a step that some wood burners didn't want to take because they didn't want to be in a registrar of wood stoves. The stage 2 waiver allows you to also burn during a stage 2 burn ban. There are two sides to the stage 2 waiver. You can have, you need to submit information to qualify yourself for a no other adequate source of heat, no ash, which means if you have nothing in your home except a wood stove, you have to certify again that it is EPA compliant and you know what you're doing and you know how to do it well. That's okay. I mean, those are important. You have to be, if you have a wood stove, you have to use it. Or if your heating source, your wood source, is tied into your home heating system in such a way that if you were not to burn, it would damage it. I know there's some complicated systems out there. I don't have one, but you can get a no ash for that. And again, this allows people to have the security of being able to burn during a burn ban. The second part of the no ash waiver, which is something that people really also had a problem with, was the fact that you could also qualify for a no ash if you had financial difficulties. In order to qualify for this, you would need to be on some sort of government assistance. WIC, Denali Care, food stamps, cash assistance, any of the government available programs for assistance would qualify you for being on a no ash. Some of these are relatively easy to get, and some of these are incredibly invasive, and the paperwork involved is intense to be able to qualify for things like food stamps and cash assistance. So the problem that I myself personally have, and I believe that other people have as well, is that this step is one that people really had a problem with. The fact that you had to go through the invasive process of filling out paperwork and laying your life open to another government agency in order to get help for the fact that you couldn't help yourself is quite demoralizing, and it is a difficult thing for people to look somebody else in the eye and say, I'm on food stamps. In order to qualify for a no ash under the financial difficulties, you have to go and fill out the paperwork and show somebody at the borough your information. You had to show them that you had a Denali card or you had a food stamps card. And that is something that people, especially Alaskans, are not going to accept. The fact that they had to take that step to begin with, and then they had to take that a step further and go and tell somebody else that they're on government assistance and now must have permission to burn wood. It's not going to happen. Of the, what I think 140 no ash waivers that were given out, only 3 of those waivers had financial caveats attached to it. So only 3 people applied for the no ash waivers because of financial straits. And I know, given the economic diversity of this community, there are more people than 3 that are on some type of government assistance. They didn't fill out those waivers because they didn't want other people to know that they were on government assistance, especially whenever, up to this point, they were able to independently heat their home with wood without permission from the borough, without letting anybody else know. That next step lets everybody know. The information for getting all of these rules out can be found on the websites. Whenever the rules first rolled out, the website and ads and everything were given out as the way to get information from the borough, the way to find the rules, the way to know what's going on. But the website is a very difficult thing to maneuver. It is not mobile friendly. It is not very user friendly. The laptop version or the desktop version or whatever there's too much information all jam-packed in there, and it's very, very difficult to find the information that you're looking for. The reason that I was able to find that information and give it to the residents of the wood-burning community is because I spent an extensive amount of time going through all of the data, looking through all of the burn rules and all of the stuff, and even I got some of that wrong. I had to get some clarification from the assembly members and then redistribute that information to make sure that the wood-burning community had the correct information. The borough, I know, has known about the fact that their website is very difficult to maneuver and that it is not mobile friendly for quite some time, and for whatever reason hasn't been able to sort of streamline it into a place that people can use to get information. The borough has, I just believe, or the assembly anyway, has approved a $700,000 PR campaign over like 4 years' time to get information out to the public about the availability of the no-ash waivers and all the rules and stuff that go into the curtailment programs. And if they had just spent part of that money and trying to streamline the only tool that has every single piece of information available to anybody in the borough who has any questions about the wood smoke program or the air quality, and that's the borough website. That's got every piece of information that you need, and that website needs to be picked up and streamlined so that people can have access to it immediately, which is why it needs to be mobile friendly and be able to get the information they need. Oh, gosh. So I think that we need to keep thinking of each other, and I lost my place, hold on. So thinking of each other as neighbors and as friends and as people who need to come together to solve the problem is sort of paramount. We sort of focus on just the numbers that we need to attain, and the numbers, and they don't take into account that there are people here that live in this community, and people have to keep warm. People have to use wood to stay warm. People have to be able to breathe clean air. And there has to be some way to meet in the middle, because at the extreme temperatures that we get, and generally speaking, those extreme temperatures come with inversions, people are going to do the only thing they can in order to stay warm. And if that includes breaking the rules in order to do that, they're going to. And it's so sad that there has to be this sort of push and take with trying to figure out where the line is for where is the best place to be to get clean air and to allow people to burn wood in the most economical and responsible way possible. I believe the borough's program with the education of the split stack store, those are great tools, and the borough should keep doing those things. The borough's smoke patrol is also a very good thing to continue if we're not trying to look for and punish bad burners. The smoke patrol allows the borough's finances and stuff to be used to go and follow the borough and map out the areas where there are stronger areas of concentration and less areas of concentration, and then they can focus those efforts on educating the people who are in those areas if they're burning correctly, if they need to fix something, if they need to switch out their stove. These are important things that we need for data points, but people are scared of the smoke patrol because they don't want to be caught burning whenever there's a burn ban. The education that the borough has started, again, I just said, is paramount to be able to educate people to the fact that, one, there are extreme conditions in our area that cannot be fixed. There isn't going to be a time when this area is not going to see negative 40 degree temperatures. And currently, we have pretty reasonable fuel rates, and the last few winters, or probably the last 5 winters, have been pretty mild. There have been winters, and I said it before, where temperatures were in the negative 60s for weeks on end. There have been times when fuel has been at $5 a gallon. And if we ever reach a point in time where we get back to those extreme cold temperatures and a time when the fuel oil climbs to $4 or $5 a gallon, every single rule, whether they were made with good intentions or not, is going to be tossed out the window, because the people that were using fuel oil because they wanted to are now going to be switching to wood heat because it's cheaper and it's available. So we have to keep those things in mind whenever we are moving forward and looking into the future about what kinds of tools are available for people to use their homes with. I think that's all I've got. I wanted to say a couple more things before I'm done. My time's okay? You're doing great. All right. So there is a proposition on the ballot this coming October. I don't know how many people in the room are actual locals, but Proposition 4 is a proposition that will take the power away from the borough for regulating home heating. And I strongly believe that this is a proposition that needs to pass, not because I don't want to help make the air quality better, but because the rules that have been put in place are not the rules that are really going to help this community move forward. Looking into the future, there are going to be more intensive rules that the borough will be implementing. And we already know from past experience that the curtailments didn't work, and making forced registrations or making other rules that are going to force the wood burning community to feel like that back is against the wall. We don't want to reach that point. And if we can get the borough to let go of its control, of its power, and give the power back to the people, we can implement other ways of cleaning the air that does not involve curtailment, because curtailment isn't going to happen. Curtailment isn't going to be a source that people are going to listen to and follow. So I'm strongly in support of Proposition 4 and vote yes. So that's all I got.
Well, thank you, Wendy. So Wendy will be back with us again at 10:45. We have a 30-minute panel discussion, Q&A with Wendy and a couple other guest speakers. Real quick, I'm going to tee up the next presentation, and Lenine, help me find that real quick here. While Lenine's doing that for me, I just want to recognize another elected official I saw pop in. Well, there's actually two I see now. Mayor Ward from North Pole, wave your hand. He's back there being all quiet. And then I see Director, IGU, Interior Gas Utility Director Patrice Lee. Patrice is back there. Say hi. And you're teeing it up.
Jennifer's here.
And Jennifer's here. Okay, so right now we're going to tee up a video from Dr. Owen Hanley. And the next speaker to introduce is Jennifer Gleason Schmidt. And so we're going to show the video first. It's about 27 minutes long. And then I'm going to read her bio, and then Lenine's going to hit go. So Jennifer Gleason Schmidt, she's sitting here behind me, has been a nurse in Alaska for over 45 years, 27 of which was in public health. Jennifer is an advocate for families and children, and she served on the Fairbanks North Star Borough School District Board for 12 years. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Gleason Schmidt.
We're going to go ahead and show this film, and then there'll be a few minutes for questions. There'll be a break, and then there will be a question and answer session. Dr. Owen Hanley and I have been working on trying to educate people about the health effects of PM 2.5 air pollution. And, you know, when we mention to people that a lot of the problems that we see, health problems we see in our community, could be related to PM 2.5, they say, my doctor never told me about that. So we've actually done some presentations to healthcare providers in the community. A lot of the research has been done really in the last 10 to 15 years. And we have copies out there when we take our break, if you could pick up a packet. There's just tremendous information coming out every year. There's one article in the packet of just the research from 2000, some of the highlights of the research from 2017. We need to look at that when we're making our decisions about air quality in Fairbanks. So let's listen to Dr. Hanley. He is not in town right now, or he would be here. He does a really good presentation, and then I'll highlight some of the things I think are important that we think about. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Owen Hanley. So after medical school and specialty training, I came to Fairbanks to practice pulmonology. That's taking care of people who've got lung disease. And sometimes the cause of the lung disease was very obvious. It was the cigarettes they smoked or the asbestos they had inhaled at work. But a lot of the times, the cause of their breathing problems and health problems wasn't so obvious. It was some antigen that they'd inhaled that had caused an immunologic reaction, or some obscure allergen that it inhaled. So many times it took a long time to figure out what it was that was causing their health problem. And so the takeaway that I learned from my years in lung disease, that is going to be the takeaway of today's talk, is that the air you breathe in has a much bigger connection to whether you're healthy or sick than you realize. And that many times the sickness that happens in our family or the death that happens in our family may be caused by a culprit that we never suspected. So how do we miss the connection sometimes between the cause and the effect? And the reason is it's about how our minds work. There's kind of two ways to know about the world, and one is big data, and others our experience. So your insurance company knows lots more about you and your risk of getting sick than you do. They probably know how much alcohol you buy, whether you smoke cigarettes, what your weight is, whether you have a gym membership. Big data gives them all this information. Netflix knows more about you than you know about you probably. You've maybe done a Google search and on good home juice mixers. And then 2 days later, you're looking up an Aurora research thing and you see, oh, there's an ad for the Cuisinart juice mixer. I wonder how they knew I wanted one. So this is the way that they make billions on this, because they know about statistics and can manage it. But for most of us, our experience comes from a small amount of our personal experience, the headlines we saw as we go by the checkout counter at Fred Meyer's, looking at the headlines, some anecdotes from our friends, and have a very small area of experience that helps us to understand the world. So most people, they lock the doors at night, they make sure no crazed intruder is going to come in and shoot them, when it's 1,000 times more likely that they're going to die from what they are eating or what they're inhaling than from some intruder. It's a really, really unlikely thing. But we don't see the big picture about what's causing our health and what's going to cause our death. So I'll talk about the big picture. Why do we get sick? Why do people die? So big data tells us that, well, genes is a little bit. You might have inherited something, but largely it's the environment. Why we get sick has largely to do with the environment. So by that, I mean there's lots of things in the environment. Sun exposure, lots of it turns young skin into old skin. Eating too much grease results in young arteries becoming older arteries. Too much loud noise makes young ears deaf. But the big exposure that people have to the environment that they don't realize how impactful it is breathing. Because you eat 3 or 4 times in a 24-hour period. But how long do you go without breathing? You can go for more than a month without eating and survive. People live 6 weeks on these rafts and survive. But how long can you hold your breath without losing consciousness? So we breathe in, just sitting here, you're all breathing in 5 or 10 liters, quarts, a minute. If you go for a run, you might be breathing in more than 100 liters per minute. So over the course of a day, you inhale about 10,000 liters of the air you breathe that the body has to process and deal with any toxins that are in it. This is a sign I think I took in the Dubai airport a few months ago coming through. So they were trying to tell you something about the things they were selling in there. So the lung is a filter. The body does a pretty good job of getting rid of a lot of the toxins that it's exposed to. So the big particles, they settle out in the upper airway. Our nose catches the big particles in the back of our throat. And the medium-sized particles, they kind of fall out in the upper airway. But those little particles that are less than 2.5 microns, they're so small that they get all the way down to the alveolar sacs in the lungs. And that's the PM 2.5, those 2.5. Really small particles, less than 1 micron, just go right through the cell walls into the cells directly themselves. So as soon as the particles land on the wet surface on the alveoli, they release the things on their surface, the chemicals. So think of a Lipton tea bag being dropped into hot water and you see that splash of color coming out of the Lipton tea bag. That's what happens when a particle that you've inhaled lands on the wet surface of the alveoli and releases all the chemicals on the surface. So where does most of the PM 2.5 in Fairbanks come from? It's different every place. If you're in Nepal, it comes from concrete dust, and it comes from cooking dung or cement works. But in Fairbanks, we have a different source of PM 2.5, and it's largely 60%, 70% from wood smoke. So the problem with wood smoke is that it comes from the incomplete combustion of wood. So it produces an enormous amount of particles and chemicals because it isn't completely combusted. If we completely combusted it, it would just be water and CO2. But the furnace isn't hot enough to completely combust it. It's way too cold. So the chemicals from the wood smoke are the problem. The particles themselves aren't as much of a problem. It's the chemicals on those particles that you inhale. And these are some of them. There are hundreds of particles, chemicals on those particles that if you look them all up, they're like these particles. They're proven toxins. So where do the chemicals go? Well, once they've reached the alveoli and get dissolved, they go into the bloodstream, and they go every place that blood goes. That's pretty much everywhere. You get blood to your brain, you get blood to your liver, you get blood to your kidney. The blood goes through the placenta to a baby. And we'll talk about how every single organ those chemicals touch is a place where harm is caused. And you can list the disease. You name the place, and if blood goes there, there's a connection. So what are the chemicals? How do the chemicals hurt us? Well, some of the chemicals are cancer-producing. Some are DNA damagers. They alter the DNA itself to cause a damage, like in the fetus. They're clot provokers, so they make the blood sticky, so clots happen in different parts of the body, in the head, in the heart, in the lungs. They're inflammation provokers. Inflammation means they cause some inflammation, whether it's in a joint or a kidney or a lung, and that inflammation causes damage. Or they're direct cytotoxins. So if they're toxic to the kidney, we call them hepatotoxins. If they're toxic to the kidney, we call them nephrotoxins. If they're toxic to the nervous system, they're neurotoxins. But there are many of these chemicals that are all of these things. So what's the safe amount of these things to inhale? Well, you tell me, how many cigarettes do you want your 10-year-old smoking? How about limiting it to 10 a day? Is that safe? How about just 4 a day? Well, the EPA tries to set some limits for these things. But the important thing about these limits, so in the United States, 35 is the PM 2.5 limit. In Australia, it's only 25. EU says it's 20. But these are regulatory limits. Regulatory limits. They're not safety limits. So we know levels of PM 2.5 of 5 are hazardous. So these limits just is the level EPA makes up and says, well, beyond this level, we can't stand it anymore. We've got to stop this. This is such a public health problem, we got to intervene. It's kind of like them saying, cigarettes, you can't sell cigarettes to 5-year-olds, or not even 10-year-olds. You have to be at least 21 to buy cigarettes. It's not because it's suddenly at age 22, you can say, well, finally it's safe for me to smoke. I'm 22 now. They don't let you smoke get the cigarettes before 21. But after 22 or 3, it's safe to smoke. It is not safe to smoke. It's just a regulation. It's nothing to do with the health of cigarettes. It's just as damaging to a 22-year-old as it is to an 18-year-old. EPA has to have an arbitrary rule. 35 is absolutely arbitrary, has nothing to do with it being safe below that. So if you say, oh, good, the PM 2.5 is only 20 today, or 15 today, it's good. It is not good. It's like smoking, instead of smoking 6 packs a day, you only smoke a half pack a day, you think you're healthy. You're not. So if you're breathing PM 2.5 levels at 35, that means that when you, an ordinary person, during an ordinary day, will inhale about 100 million particles. Just do the numbers. 35, levels of 35, that many breaths, that's how it is in a 24-hour period. So the lung has some pretty good, and the body has some pretty good defense mechanisms, but that just, it can't handle all that. The things about the particles matter a lot. So there's different kind of particles in Nepal or India or Los Angeles than we have here. And it's very complicated, but basically the shape matters. You can imagine that this is going to be impaled somewhere. If that lands in your lung, it's probably going to be hard to get it out. It's not like a ball bearing that rolls easily. Some particles have shapes that just impale themselves on the spot they land. Size matters. The smaller, the worse it is. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but the smaller the particles get, the deeper in it they can travel. Big particles, you can't get a bowling ball through your mouth. A baseball is hard to get in your lungs. But the smaller it gets, the deeper it can go. So the smaller it is, the greater the surface area. If I put a bowling ball down here, about this much of it probably touches the table. But if this bowling ball sized thing was actually a container full of talcum powder, and I opened it up and spread it on the floor, boy, that's a big cleanup job. So the smaller the particle, the bigger the cleanup mess, the more particles there are per volume. So small is bad. It overwhelms the mechanisms that we have to remove the stuff, and it determines where the harm occurs. So you look for cancers in certain spots because you know where they're going to land based on their size. The composition of the particle matters. So PM 2.5 is a dangerous kind of vehicle because of what it can carry. So wood smoke has about 12 times the potential to cause lung cancer as cigarette smoke. The reason is cigarettes are, you think about it, are pretty simple. It's just a leaf. It's a very dry wood is good. Think about dry tobacco leaf, a pretty pure product, and it's smoked at a very high temperature. So if you were to put a thermistor at the end of a cigarette when someone inhales, and you see that cigarette light up, it's about 900 degrees Fahrenheit. So it burns it pretty completely, more to CO2 and water than does your wood stove. The wood stove is not just a pure leaf. It's all kinds of parts of wood and other things, and it burns at half the temperature, which means it isn't as complete a combustion. So there's more toxins coming off of a wood stove than there will be out of a hot cigarette or when they have something at a power plant that they can run at a very, very high temperature. The higher the temperature, the stack is going to have fewer particles. So what are the hazards of this stuff you're inhaling? Well, is it a little thing, just a little deal, a little augmentation to our illness, or is it a big augmentation to the illnesses we all face? Well, air pollution contributes to 4 of the 5 leading causes of death. We die mainly because of heart attacks, strokes, cancers, and respiratory illnesses. Those are the big 4. And air pollution is a contributor to all of those. Well, how big a thing are we talking about here? So here's the annual death rates from different things. Now, most women think breast cancer is a pretty scary thing. A lot of women die of breast cancer that you know. But breast cancer causes fewer deaths than air pollution. These aren't my numbers. These are national numbers. Men worry about prostate cancer, but lots more people are going to die from air pollution than die from prostate cancer. And you always see here in the paper all the gun deaths. We think about gun deaths, but gun deaths are smaller. The Vietnam War, in 10 years of fighting, when I was a young man, killed more than 50,000 American young men. China's health agents say that last year, air pollution in China killed 500,000 people. That's 10 times more than the whole Vietnam War. Vietnam War killed 50,000 people. Every year, we lose 50,000 people in this country from air pollution. So this is not a small matter. So 50,000 is our country, 500,000 is China. So we only have 1/10 as much. Well, why is that? Well, there's more people in China, but it's only 3 times as many people. So how come they have 10 times as many deaths? Have you seen pictures of Beijing in the big cities? They have bad pollution. That's why they have more deaths. Most of this country have pretty clean air. That's not Fairbanks. We're more like Beijing, so we can expect a much higher death rate than San Diego from air pollution in our community, more like Beijing. The other thing about the air pollution and these other causes of death, if you look back at them, some are preventable and some are not. You know, if Bill Gates came and said, Owen, I hear you guys got some problems with excess deaths in Fairbanks. Here's $50 million. Just get rid of some of those preventable deaths, make things better in Fairbanks. Well, if I took that $50 million and said, okay, I'm going to go see if I can help the community, you know, I don't think I could put much of a dent in breast cancer because, you know, beyond getting the mammograms and getting their therapy, we don't have some special new intervention we have that's suddenly going to get the breast cancer rate down to 0 in Fairbanks. We don't have the medical understanding, the technical understanding to do it. Or I couldn't help men much with their prostate cancer because we don't have a way to fix it. I don't think I'd make a big impact on the other 2 either. But you give me that money and we can solve air pollution in Fairbanks because we know the problem. We know the solution. It's not a mystery. It's not a scientific thing that can't be fixed. It's a matter of putting our resources to fix the problem. It's not cheap, but it's doable. It's a solvable problem, whereas right now we don't have a direct solution to make these go away. So we talked about the death from air pollution, but I'd like to talk about what is actually a bigger problem. In war, military leaders will tell you it's much better to injure the other soldier than to kill him. And the reason is, if you kill one of your enemy, you have 1 fewer people and the person in the battlefield to deal with. If you wound one of your enemy, that requires a whole bunch of people to carry the wounded man. You need medics to take care of him. You have to ship him someplace. It takes a lot of resources out of the Army to care for 1 wounded person, to carry them on a stretcher. Whereas 1 death only takes 1 person away from your opponent's army. It's the same way with our health resources, that a death is bad. A chronic illness that lasts for decades or disables someone is very costly in human lives and in money. Or the kids growing up in an air-polluted area that causes them never to reach their potential is a very expensive problem for decades on end. So a lot of the health problems that we have are very expensive, and the impact is very large. So for example, we know that blood clots, DVT means deep venous thrombosis, blood clots increase 70% for every 10 microgram increase in PM2.5. Today the PM2.5 is really low, it's like 5 or something, it's low. But on a bad day in North Pole, it might be more than 100. So do the numbers. 10 times this is 10 times this. That means there'll be a 700% increase in the number of clots that happen to people in North Pole than there would have happened. So clots means clots heart attacks, clots strokes, clots legs. So when someone has a stroke or a heart attack, oh, you don't link it to air pollution, but that's what caused it. That's what the big data I talked about earlier said. Why did that happen? It's not obvious, but big data tells us that's what the cause is. We know that spikes in air pollution make your blood pressure go up in 30 minutes. Heart rhythms become irregular. You get atrial fibrillation. That causes heart attacks. That causes strokes because clots forms in your heart. We know that Alzheimer's occurs earlier as the pollution levels rise. So if any of you have a twin sister who live in San Diego and you live in North Pole, we know that dementia is going to occur 2 years earlier if you for the sister who lives in North Pole. There's very good data about dementia and air pollution risk. So as the longer you're living in an area that has high PM 2.5, the greater your risk of that. So these are all, the whole list of things like this. I was visiting a friend when I went skiing in Minnesota, and he said, you know, my medical journal, he's a urologist, said, we found that high levels of PM 2.5 are causing more kidney failure. It causes a kind of kidney inflammation. Did you know that? I didn't know that. But it's just, when they look, they find the connections happen everywhere blood goes. Everywhere blood goes is here too. These chemicals are just like everything else that go across the placenta. The food in the mother goes across the placenta and feeds the baby. The stuff that's on those PM 2.5 goes across too. So it's a great concern to me that many pregnant women, again this winter, are going to spend several weeks of critical fetal development being exposed to air that we know is toxic to their baby. That's very troubling to me. What happens is we know that those things cross the placenta, just like protein does. It goes across the placenta. It increases in miscarriages. It increases stillbirths. It increases birth defects. It causes low birth weight. All of those are very well linked to levels in air pollution. As the kids get older, the problems continue. So women who've had their pregnancy at times when air pollution levels are high, when you measure the IQ in those kids, it's lower. Maybe 5 points isn't a lot, but maybe the difference between them going to Stanford and someplace else. The neurotoxins are especially dangerous to growing brains, and that's what happens during the young development during pregnancy and afterwards. So children with these health problems become sick adults with more health problems. And that's a continuing cost we have when we don't have children reach their full potential. When the kids get a little older, it limits their ability to play outside, because we know that if you expose someone to air pollution levels like you'll have in North Pole this winter again, they're going to have decreased lung function for a week. You bring them into my pulmonary function lab, measure their lung function, send them out to play, and come back the next week. For the next week, I'll be able to document that their lung function still isn't cleared up from that one day's exposure. If they do go out and run and play, they're going to inhale way more pollutants every year. They just sat down. So you don't want them certainly go out and exercise. And that's something that's worrisome. So children who grow up in polluted areas, their lung size is smaller than those who grew up in healthy air. That's something that's not recoverable. It's not like if they suddenly, at age 21, move to San Diego to continue their dreams of becoming an Olympic miler, that the lungs are suddenly going to grow again. It's there forever. They didn't get bigger lungs. Something happened in development that was stunted. It'll never be full size. So have to decide where you live if you have kids that you want to have who might have Olympic dreams. So with all this in mind, what should we do? And I think the most important word is the we, because we talked about eating and inhaling as the two ways we get most of the environmental impact on us. Well, individually, I think we have some choice and control over what our family eats. And if we don't like the water at school, we can send our kid to school with a water bottle. But you can't send your girl to school with an air bottle. We don't have control over that. We don't have control over the air you're going to breathe when you drive to town. You don't have control over the air your high school student runs at the West Valley track. We don't have an individual control over the air we breathe. We depend on what our neighbors and community as a group are doing that determines the health of the air each of us breathes individually. So this is a we problem. We as a community have a bad air problem, and only we as a community can solve the air problem, bad air problem. It's not something any one of us can solve, and ourselves being individualists like the food we put in our dinner table. So this is different than that sorts of environmental things. We don't want them to eat all that greasy food, the salty food, the too much sugar. You can control that individually. But this is something that you can't control. I can't control individually. We need to talk with our neighbors and our community and our leaders to solve this problem. And the first step probably is understanding that have us all realize that these problems we talked about are real. They're not fake news. That these impacts are here today, and they're going to continue to affect all of us and our neighbors unless we do something about them. I guess that's why we're here today, to do something about them. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. So you can see why I didn't want to try to present Dr. Hanley's talk. I think he does a really good job of explaining why we're all here. Citizens for Clean Air had this turned into the video. I had it edited, and it is on YouTube. So if you found this information interesting, spread the word, pass it on to other friends of yours who weren't able to be here today. So as a nurse for over 45 years, one of the reasons I enjoyed that field so much is that I believe that if people have good information, especially about their health, and especially about their kids' health, they can make changes, and they often do make changes. Now, where we are right now with air pollution is where we were about 50 years ago with cigarette smoke. When it first came out that cigarette smoke caused lung cancer, people didn't want to believe it, okay? And it took 10 years or so before people started believing it. It took almost 20 years before other kinds of measures were really taken and implemented. And then, maybe about 20 years ago, people started talking about secondhand smoke. And even now, you've got people who still smoke, but they go outside and they smoke outside to protect their kids. However, they could have a wood stove inside, and every time they open their wood stove, there could be a different type of smoke coming in and affecting their kids, and their kids could be exposed to smoke outside. But I do believe that people will make changes if they think that it could improve people's health. I appreciate the time on the agenda for health to be discussed. The last couple of summits have really focused on burning wood to produce less particulates, but very little time has been spent on health, and that is why we're here. People totally get it. Okay, the people in North Pole totally get it. They know that there's been some toxins in their water out there, and they demanded that something be done about their water, to get the toxins out of their water, to get clean water. Somehow or another, there is no connection between the fact that they're being exposed to toxins in their water, or were, and toxins in the air. Unfortunately, this whole discussion in our community became a non-regulatory, regulatory discussion rather than a health discussion that we needed to do something about. So I'm concerned about all the young athletes that are working their little hearts to death when they're running, swimming, playing basketball, playing hockey. I mean, they are playing in some of the worst air quality in the country. And we do know that within 15 minutes of being exposed to that, there are cardiovascular changes. Changes in the blood vessels, and that means changes in the blood flow in the heart. We have international Nordic ski races up here. It's one of the most aerobic sports, in existence, Nordic skiing, and we have international races up here. Fortunately, they're at a little bit of a level, but I really wonder if we should even be inviting people to come exercise here in the winter. You know, we raised our family here because it was a great community. And every time we got off the plane after being outside visiting family, we would go, oh, it smells so great. You know, you'd walk out of the airport and go, wow. You know, my kids did that all the time. And in 2009, we walked out of the airport and they went, what the heck? What is that smell? So they will not move back here. And I can't stay here in the winter. And that makes me really sad. So I am interested in this because I want to protect those young athletes. I want to protect the mothers who are pregnant, the families that want to have kids, healthy kids, okay? I mean, a young family scraping by, just getting started, they don't have the option of moving outside for a couple of months in the winter, you know? And how scary would that be, you know, to be pregnant and wonder, should I be breathing this air? So there are packets out on that table out there of health information that additional health information that you might find interesting. It's the same information we provided for some of the physician talks. Some of it is from EPA, has some nice diagrams. Then there's a article of research in 2017 from the Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. They are also in a valley. Salt Lake City's in a valley. They have about 400 physicians there that are very concerned about, you know, the health effects there. And I'll tell you, they became concerned for two reasons. The changes they saw in the number of miscarriages when they had increases in air pollution, and also the impact it was having on people coming there for tourism in the winter, which is a big deal there. So anyway, this is just research from 2017, and it covers a lot of different parts of the body that you just wouldn't think about. I mean, how many people do you know that have inflammatory diseases or things that are made worse? Inflammatory bowel disease, cancer, you know, breast cancer survivors have a lower rate of reoccurrence if they live in areas with clean air. And anyway, then there's another thing with the American College of Cardiology on how to avoid air pollution. It's kind of hard when it's so widespread here. You know, we would have to change this if we were to make some sort of posters or something for our community. And then there's an article in Bulletin, Epidemiological Bulletin from the state of Alaska. This was published with data from 2003 to 2008 showing that when air quality was bad, there were more admissions to the ER and the hospital for heart attacks and heart problems. Unfortunately, they were taking data up until 2008, and we've talked to the medical director for public health hoping that we could get, you know, the last 10 years data. I think that might be really interesting. There's a lot of people here who think, well, you know, we really need more data. Well, we do need more data maybe on how the inversions might be a little different here, or what the composite, you know, we do have good data on the competitions, the composition of our pollution problem. But, you know, the human body here, if you're exposed to pollution here, or you're exposed to pollution in another community, the human body reacts pretty much the same. We have a small population, less than 100,000. That's why there isn't a lot of studies done in communities our size, epidemiological studies. There was one huge study that came out in December of 2017 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a landmark study, and they looked at Medicare, older people, Medicare deaths, related to air pollution in every zip code of the United States, except Hawaii and Alaska, unfortunately. And we did ask the state medical director, could we ask just for Anchorage and Fairbanks, you know, so that we could compare that data. But bottom line is, you know, when the air pollution went up in very short period of time, 1 or 2 days, they saw lots more deaths of older people, people on Medicare, most of them were over 65, from all all kinds of events, but you see a higher death rate in those days. And then there's another article, I thought it was in this packet anyway. Some of them may be a little different, but there's a California children's study. You can just write that down. You can look it up online. And that is another landmark study. They studied children in 13 or 14 different communities in California over a 20-year period. The students the children, and they followed them if they moved, okay? So if they lived in a community with poor air quality and that community cleaned up their air, their lung function improved. Their lungs will never grow, just as Dr. Hanley said, will never grow to their maximum potential, but their lung function would improve, okay? Their asthma would have improved or their lung function tests. If they were in a community that had good air quality and moved to one that was bad, their lung function went down. So what we can say is, if we improve the air in our community, our kids' lungs are going to be better. We know that. We don't need data about that. We do know that. So we're going to be having a panel discussion. There'll be more time for questions. I really urge you to grab those packets and really look at them at home. There's lots of resources listed in them. If anybody tells you there isn't good information on health effects of air pollution, they're not looking, because the amount of research that's been done in the past 10 years is really astounding. And thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. So Jennifer's packets that she handed out when Lenny and I were just talking, we're going to get those posted on the website here as quick as we can if you'd like to get an electronic copy of them. Real quick, another housekeeping task here. If you got one of these little blue, light blue cards here when you checked in, this is it says enter to win a woodshed. This is what you register for any of the door prizes. So Mr. Wagner, I know you probably will have a hard time getting a woodshed back to Washington, D.C., but feel free to register. So.
I just don't want to be taken to the woodshed.
There you go, taken to the woodshed. So we are at the point in our presentation where we're going to take a short break. So if everybody wants to get a snack or some coffee or mingle with friends, we're going to meet back here at 9:45. Glenn, do you have the wood burning demo kind of cranking up outside?
No, the weather is...
He says the weather's not permitting. We're in Fairbanks. Come on, man. All right, 9:45, we'll be back from our break.
Hopefully if the weather breaks, we'll do it in the afternoon.
Okay.
We were kind of concerned that the rain maybe cool off the snacks. So it's funny, you have a presentation on it, so
Okay.
as a contingency.
All right, I'm going to tip. Say again? They're out of blue cards, so let's fix that. Okay, thank you.
Oh, did she take the other packets out?
I think looks like she did. Hi, Glenn. Hi, Gillian. I remembered you from last year.
Yeah, nice to see
I'm
you.
going to tee up your presentation real quick. We had to do some maneuvering on your stuff because we had a little IT security incident and we banned thumb drives.
No,
so,
you should.
So I took care of it. I'm going to tee it up right now.
Okay.
So, yeah, I
No,
kind
my
of found a
fiance
workaround.
works in the security industry, and he said something like 90% of all USB sticks have a virus.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Like 4 more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can I turn this off so that people don't see my stuff? And we're out of blue cards for the drawings.
So there's just white cards out there. He's brainstorming, but if you go farther, you should tell everyone.
okay.
Hi, this is Jennifer. Yeah, you were here last year? I couldn't hear you. Yeah, okay. I thought we met briefly, but it was, yeah.
So we're going to have 1, 2, and Wendy.
Yes,
Okay,
right?
yes, yeah, and we'll have you just sit right in the middle of the stage.
Okay, all right. It's just questions.
Yeah, we've got some questions. Oh, good. Brainstormed already, and then I can walk around with the mic and folks have.
Dr. Hamlin's video was brilliant. It was so well.
You know, he presents it so calmly, and, you know, really, I mean, I was watching everybody. There was no one
In this room. Yeah. No, I was like, I did the same thing. I was like standing around, breathing and breathing. That's what they need to do. Well, they may do it.
And
There are some, but
some of that information is not. I mean, just in the past years,
enormous amounts of research. I know, and it's funny, last night I got a good night's sleep. But I've probably 6 or 7 years. I just checked the research, and you see, you know, sometimes there's a systematic review, but usually sometimes it's a poster that has a title that's groundbreaking. And I just print those out, I read them, and then just watching my photo those. It used to be like this.
Yeah.
Because I like to just print them out, you know.
really had both of them.
Right.
Not stuff about where evolution is. And you know, everybody thought it was in LA.
Right.
The health of that reality.
Well, I know you're absolutely right.
I don't need to make it up. I mean, when smoking first, you know, I mean, first everybody made the connection with cancer, but and then it was another 10 or 15 years before it was heart disease, and then another 10 or 15 years before it was, you know, other kidneys,
yes,
eyes,
exactly.
Alzheimer's, wrinkles. I mean,
Okay, everybody, we got about 2 minutes. We're going to get started, trying to stay on track here. So if you can start making your way back to your seats and getting comfortable, much appreciated. How you doing, Brian?
How you doing?
Good seeing you. Thanks for everything you're doing on the stakeholders group.
Good luck getting everybody back together.
The mayor and I have intentionally been kind of staying away here.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Are you doing Well, I've heard you. I've seen you.
Are you ready? We got you set up. We'll play a little technical.
Traveling, so I'm like, here. Yep. So it's all good. Yeah.
We did a little technical kung fu. We got there, man.
I'm glad. Did you get to use the link from the Google Drive?
I moved, so she sent the folder, the file, zip file, to my Google Drive, and my personal one, and I downloaded from there, virus scan, and make sure it was good.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay, campers, about 30 seconds. So, like Commissioner Wagner said, looks like we might be taking folks to the woodshed. Hi, Nalina.
right after the show.
Thank you. We're going to get started here in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah, go ahead, find a seat.
We've got this turned back on.
Oh, I didn't. You're just sitting here quiet, huh? Okay. Well, you want to introduce Gillian?
Yeah, so this, whatever was turned back on, that you?
It's all on, yeah. It's all good. And just
Okay,
introduce
yep.
Gillian, so.
Okay, folks, we're going to get started again.
herding cats.
I know. Isn't that the truth? Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started again. My name is Lenine Livingston, and I'm the Public Information Officer for the Fairbanks North Star Borough, and it's my honor to introduce my friend Gillian Gahn Middlestat. Gillian is the director of the Partnership for Air Matters, an organization that equips families with the tools and knowledge to reduce their exposure to ambient and indoor air pollution. Her focus is on the development of preventative, low-cost solutions and on communicating risk to decision makers about the health risks associated with fine particle air pollution. She also leads the Tribal Healthy Homes Network, an award-winning coalition recognized by the Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for its work in addressing indoor air hazards in tribal housing through education, research, training, and culturally tailored interventions. Gillian is a member of the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Air Act Advisory Committee and co-chair of the National Coalition on Safe and Healthy Housing. At the state level, she served as the chair of the Washington State Asthma Initiative and chair of the Washington Leadership Council for the American Lung Association. She has a master's degree in public administration and is a second-year doctoral student at the University of Chicago. Would you all please join me in welcoming Gillian Gahn Middlestat?
Hi. First, I want to thank Lenine, and thank you for inviting me back. I was here last year. I'm from Seattle, as Lenine may have mentioned, and I just wanted to note that even though I'm in Seattle, I've spent kind of since the time I left last year reading the Fairbanks News-Miner, reading the different articles, the different issues that have come up, and reading all of the comments. And I have to, and I don't see Wendy in the room, but I see anger and distrust and fear, and then I see like some of the most amazing discourse. And I think you're one of the most progressive communities in the nation, to be honest, because I see everybody moving past some of their issues, including from the government, whether it's practitioners, people who are working, and there's Wendy, thank you. I've read all your comments. I mean, I just am very impressed that you are working with some of the most difficult circumstances and issues in the country, and it's obviously the independence and the kind of people you have here that are moving you forward, so I'm impressed. I do want to say, though, sort of the elephant in the room is that it's normal to be suspicious of the speaker and the messenger, right? Are you using data as a weapon? Are you here to convince me to move my position, right? And it's a pretty normal sense that we all have as humans to distrust until we know whether we can relate to that person. So I'm going to spend 1 minute before I start and just kind of tell you who I am as a person. Mother of 3 children, though they're not so much children anymore. They're 24, 21, and 14. 2 of them have asthma. My parents, between the 2 of them, have had 4 cancers. My mom has COPD. My dad's currently in the last stages of Alzheimer's, and it's a horrible disease, and I'm sure you all have someone in your life who's had it. My mother's COPD and my kid's asthma, I've spent hundreds of hours as the daughter or the caregiver, and that means in the ER, sleeping on the floor of their room, talking to the physicians, basically seeing that I was pretty powerless, which is an awful position to be in. So I do come from the frame that I wish I didn't have to have those experiences, but I do. And then I also want to say, though, that my profession happens to be understanding and being immersed in the science and then trying to translate that into the communities that I work with. I've worked with tribal, rural, cold climate, low-income communities for about 25 years. And I can't take the science into those communities from the Center for Disease Control or from EPA or the Department of Health and with a straight face and say, let's do this verbatim. Because they can't, because there's realities like you have here about cost, affordability, whether it's culturally relevant. So I walk a line of trying to bring the science that does matter to our lives and bring the realities of the communities together to try to find solutions. One of the reasons I'm really honored and appreciative to be here because I see that happening on the ground here. Really quick question. First of all, how many of you have either heard of statins, been on statins, know of someone on statins to lower their cholesterol? Okay. How many of you have either heard of or been on, and this is going to reduce the audience by 50%, but have been on prenatal vitamins? Right? Okay. And I have too. And why did we take those or know of someone? Because our doctor told us to, right? And why did our doctor tell us? Did the doctor know for sure that if we took a statin, we wouldn't eventually have a heart attack or that our child wouldn't be born premature with birth defects? Our doctor didn't know that. But what he or she had to do was take the body of evidence that said, we see a pattern and we see consistent themes across people who take statins. We see a reduction in heart disease. We see a reduction in birth defects. So we are now going to take that body of evidence and put it into practice. That's where we're at with air quality right now. Every single piece of science that I'm going to discuss, and I encourage you to challenge me and to go look at these individual studies yourself, but every single piece that I will discuss is because it's either coming from an individual study or a systematic review where we see a larger body of evidence growing, and that is indeed the case with air quality and human health. And we are getting to the point where a physician can make, as we just heard very eloquently, a strong recommendation about if you'd like to reduce your risk, I suggest you reduce your exposure. Tricky part with air quality is we may or may not be able to do that. Really quickly, I do want to emphasize I've been working on wood smoke and wood stove issues specifically in tribal communities probably for about 8 or 9 years. And again, so you know my perspective, I wouldn't call it my bias, is I created this slide years ago when I started to get funding and try to develop some collaborative work, was my emphasis was on reducing emissions from the combustion appliance, not necessarily on removing the appliance. And my job today isn't to discuss what's right or wrong for this community, but to show you that those were the focus that I was working on in my communities, largely because we didn't have $10 million in communities, as the air quality wasn't severe enough, to remove the appliance. So our focus has been on better fuel, better appliance, better operation of existing appliance. I also, and I'll just really quickly mention that we did work for about 2 or 3 years looking at compressed wood logs and briquettes. And I'm not going to talk about the science of those, except that it's pretty clearly established that there's a very large reduction in PM and VOCs and CO2 that's emitted by them. So I say this as an example. This is the kind of work that I like to see, which is interventions that can allow someone potentially to continue to utilize a wood-based heat, but look at ways to also protect themselves and their community. I'm going to skip through this. I just put this slide up to show you. I like to spread the responsibility. EPA and the local and state agencies are here, great, but the Forest Service and the BIA and the Department of Energy and USDA and Medicaid and Medicare all need to actually step in to weigh in, because this is a health issue, it's an economics issue, it's a forestry issue. It isn't just an environment and health issue. Okay, most important point I want to convey today is that the story we need to tell is bigger than asthma, and it's a lot more complex. So this is my brother and I won't date myself, but you can tell from the clothing that it's early 70s. So we're sitting in my grandparents' orchard, and so here's the deal. My brother and I would play in that orchard, and I went on growing up helping my granddad pick cherries, but he would burn the slash, of course, and the trimmings, which was normal. I would take the rubbish out, as they called it, and put it in the burn barrel, right? And everything was burned. All the garbage was burned. My parents both smoked heavily. My grandfather smoked. And then he heated in his home entirely using a fireplace. So my brother and I were exposed to vast amounts of PM and VOCs. Neither one of us developed asthma, right? So should that make us question the science? Does that mean that that exposure, that we didn't end up as that point? Not necessarily. Fast forward 20 years. This is the building, that far left corner in the basement. You see a little black dot. That was my office for about 6 years. The building repeatedly backflowed with raw sewage, and it would sit in the weekends, and then they would come clean it up on Mondays with a fungicide. We had over 28 different species of mold, including Stachybotrys, that black mold you hear about. Everyone in the building started getting sick, and for reasons I don't know, they started telling me. headaches, nausea, eye, nose, and throat irritation, immune suppression, sinus and lung infections. But then we started having miscarriages and preterm delivery. My 2 first children born, they were both preterm while I was in that building, 11 of the 11 pregnancies. So we were exposed to, there's wood smoke in that community. There was lead eroding paint in the building. There was eroding asbestos fibers. There was extensive mold. We do not know which of those resulted in any types of illness, and that's the problem. The science is complex. However, we do know that when we evacuated the building and it actually was boarded up, people started to improve in their health, and they no longer had the recurrent infections and the headaches. So some of the science is evolving. I want to give you another example of why it's complex. So this is a Tulalip tribal member. I believe this is from the University of Washington archives from about, I don't know, 1890, 1900. And as you can see, this fellow is down at the beach very happily smoking all of his salmon and probably looking horrified that he's on a PowerPoint presentation 118 years later. Who would have no idea the technology, what the word technology was, right? But the reason I want to show you this is many, many, many tribal elders have come up to me and said, Gillian, we didn't have asthma in our community. We didn't have emphysema. But 24/7 they used wood heat, right? They used it for cultural and spiritual purposes. They used it for cooking. They used it for heating. And they didn't observably have the kind of health outcomes. So why might that be the case? What's changed? Let's look at a couple factors. I'm sorry if the font's a little bit small depending on where you're sitting. And first of all, 150 years ago, and as you know, many people still today try to still live on a subsistence diet, which meant that those populations had a very high intake of omega-3 fatty acids. And as one thing in the science is very clear, is omega-3 fatty acid is an antioxidant. It reduces inflammation. Potentially, it may have counteracted the effect of the high exposure to wood smoke. Challenge today, of course, is we have, and this is not the story to talk about today, but we have depleted fisheries and wildlife, less access, higher cost, and there's toxins in the wildlife. There's PCBs, there's DDT, there's mercury. And we have people, whether we like it or not, we're all doing it. We're shifting to a westernized diet. It's high in trans fats. It's processed. So our dietary changes are changing the risk picture for what wood smoke and other airborne pollutants do to us. I like this visual because it does tell a story. There's a researcher at the University of Washington, and he's using laboratory mice to show what's called vascular inflammation. And on the far left, the bright light, far upper left, the bright light, as you can see, what is exhibited is inflammation, essentially, where you see the bright yellow. That's your baseline photo. The middle one was after exposure to 2 weeks of a high-fat diet. So you can see that the inflammation areas have expanded throughout the body. The researcher then took ozone and added it to the high-fat diet. And what you now see is there was a synergistic effect between the high-fat diet and the exposure to ozone, which is essentially a cocktail. Chemically, it's different from PM, so I'm not trying to make that comparison, but to demonstrate that once air quality pollutants enter the body, there is a synergistic effect potentially with both what we eat and underlying health conditions. So it's complex. Another complex factor, just to say, is in our building industry, we've absolutely changed. You saw the picture of the man sitting on the beach. People were outside much more, houses weren't airtight. As in westernized societies, we've built more and more airtight and energy-efficient buildings. There's been a very marked pattern, and that is that asthma rates have increased as homes have tightened up. There's a whole story in science behind this, but the basic explanation is that what we build our homes with, what's put into the homes, how we heat our homes, is now being hermetically sealed inside the home, right? And we're not outdoors as much. All right, some of the variables that affect health, what are the health, I'm going to talk about some of the health effects, and the previous presenters highlighted them very, very well. I'm hoping to show you that there's some variables in how we're affected. Our gender makes a difference, age, our genetics, our diet, the duration, and the severity of our exposure, socioeconomics make a difference, and our behaviors make a difference. The challenge also, aside from the variables, is that almost half of us are at risk of a chronic disease. So, no, I'm sorry, have a chronic disease in the United States today, whether that's hypertension, type 2 diabetes, asthma. There's a whole range of conditions that are considered chronic, meaning we live with them. But that also means we have millions of Americans that are more susceptible to wood smoke. Again, some of those conditions that make you more susceptible to wood smoke are diabetes, hypertension or high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, COPD, cancer because of a suppressed immune system, and of course if you have asthma. So before I go into a little bit of the science, I want to again emphasize a few key messages. By and large, what I've observed is that there's a pretty significant mismatch in the perception of wood smoke risk. And that's true across all professions, ages, populations, and communities. For years, we had a wood stove in one of the homes. I didn't know how to properly operate it. I left the door open because I liked the smell, the sweet smell of it, right? Later on, I had a pellet stove, and I didn't have it maintained properly. I did all the newbie stuff that somebody shouldn't do while my kids had asthma, right? Because I had a perception that it was wood smoke has been burned from, smoke is something that's been a part of our culture and society for millions of years. It must be benign. You know, maybe it's a nuisance. Science is changing that. We know differently now. But there still remains a mismatch in perception. The other reality that I'd say is a public policy and public health reality is it's not going away anytime soon. As a Seattle person, and I know somebody just mentioned being down in Oregon, of course, we have enormous wildfire issues, and you have had up here as well. And that's a persistent reality that's not going away anytime soon. Wood heat, because of the economics, isn't going away anytime soon. So this issue's here to stay. When I was down in Anchorage for a conference a couple of years ago, I did sort of an informal, what you'd call hallway survey. I had over 55 respondents, and I've continued to do this in my research, is kind of get a sense of how do people perceive the risks associated with wood smoke. And what you can see moving left to right is, of course, the vast majority, almost 80%, said, well, yeah, it's an irritant to our eyes and our nose and our lungs. And as you move across the continuum from left to right is severity, and the more severe the conditions, the less likely people were to recognize. And understandably, we don't all read scientific journals all day, but by and large, very few people said, yeah, wood smoke is associated with heart attacks and strokes and cancer. So that's a bit of a problem, because there's people like my mom with COPD and air quality is really bad or wildfires are really bad, and she calls me and says, you know, I could barely make it back from the grocery store. I had a hard time walking from the car into the store and back. And I was like, yeah, well, you shouldn't have been out, right? You were exerting yourself, and now you're going to be on oxygen, or I'll meet you in ER in an hour, right? And that's happened. And she's a great example of she has a perception that it's benign, even though I try to tell her differently. The energy picture, some of you may have met John Ackerley with the Alliance for Green Heat. This slide, I believe, is about, well, this was from the 2010 census, but the pattern continues, which is that heating with wood, as he said, I thought quite aptly, is proving to be, quote, the workhorse of residential renewable energy production. Now, he's at the Alliance for Green Heat. He does have an agenda. He wants to continue to see wood used, but he's also an advocate for responsible wood use. But I think his point is more that the economics are a huge factor that we can't ignore right now, and it has to be part of our solution of figuring out how to do this. I use this slide to demonstrate why is economics still a factor. On August 27, 1990, fuel worries, reviving sales of wood stoves. December 6, 2012, fighting winter with fire, wood burning on the rise, right? That's a perennial pattern. As long as fossil fuels or other types of energy are going to fluctuate, we're going to see people return to what for them is affordable and practical. Just one more perception issue and question, and this goes to the economics. We asked people, well, what are the main reasons that you burn? Because I don't want to make any assumptions in my research that I think I understand what's going on in someone else's head. But of course, you know, it did resonate with what I thought, which is over half of the people who responded said it saves them money. But as you can see in the two tall bars in the middle, I know the font's really small, but the third and fourth columns are more comfortable and like the atmosphere and sound. About only 21% wood is their only source of heat. So there's many different factors that that drive the continued use of wood heat. Again, combine now what I said about economics with the perception issue, and what we have is that wood heating choices are often economic, but the practices, like me opening the wood stove door and not servicing the pellet stove so it wasn't operating, because I had this intrinsic belief and attitude about the relative safety of wood smoke. And our perceptions are really difficult to modify. We have a almost 800,000 year relationship with fire as a society for food preparation, for spiritual and cultural purposes, cultural events, and I don't know, many of you know, backyard, using burning in the backyard has become for, what am I trying to say, just, you know, the things that people using. In my community now, and I live in a very dense urban community, people are burning almost every night in the summertime, which is crazy, so there's a resurgence. Anyway, basic survival. So economics plus perceptions means that we have a challenging issue. I'm going to now briefly go through, not briefly, but I'm going to try to touch on 6 of the types of risk. My goal, again, is not to hitch over the head, but to demonstrate a little bit of what the researchers are finding, and then for you to take this and take it in your work, whether you're a citizen, an advocate, you're going to vote on a measure, you're going to run for office. Whatever it is, I hope that you will take some of this information and put it into consideration when you're approaching the issue here in Fairbanks. Physiochemical properties of wood smoke. I think he talked about Dr. Hanley talked about the small nature of particles and that was a risk factor. So I think this slide helps demonstrate. So when you have wood smoke, over 90% of it are smaller than 1 micron, which means they behave more like a gas than a particle. This is an electron micrograph of wood smoke particles. So you can get an idea of just how fine the majority of wood smoke is. And that size, as he said, does matter. In comparison, if you look at other types of PM emissions, so on the far left is road and soil dust. Then as you move across, you have agricultural burning, residential wood combustion, diesel truck exhaust, crude oil, and construction dust. And this is, again, several different types of PM source emissions, but the size distribution varies. When you see a carbon-based substance that's burned incompletely, as in residential wood combustion or diesel exhaust, that's where you have the vast majority of it is going to be less than 1 micron. So those 2 particular types of combustion result in very, very small particles. And that's a problem from a health standpoint. As we saw in the video, those particles are transport mechanisms. They're the bridge by which we end up with all sorts of volatile organic compounds, aldehydes, benzene, oxygenated PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, dioxins. All of those are delivered to our bloodstream through those ultrafine particles. As researchers have noted, it's that small diameter that provides a large surface area per mass, and that the aggregate, again, it's a carbon substance, and that carbon aggregate acts as a carrier, and it transports toxic or biologically active compounds into the lung. But again, the lung isn't the end point. Asthma isn't the end point. The lungs are actually the gateway in the beginning of the biological journey. Very fine particles, as this researcher points out, essentially evade our body's defense system, the mucociliary defense system. When you cough, that is your body literally taking mucus and the cilia and exerting and, trying to exit any foreign matter that has come in. It's why we have mucus. It's designed to pull it into something and make it something you can cough and expel. Unfortunately, ultrafine particles can't get trapped in the mucus. They go all the way down into our lungs and into our bloodstream. And again, they may exert toxic effects. This is just a slide, again, showing, I don't know if you can see the arrow of mucus direction, but that's moving upwards. Both the cilia and the mucus in our upper respiratory and lower respiratory system are designed to trap foreign particles and move them out of the body. Whoops. All right, so this is at the alveoli that he talked about. Actually, I'll go back up for a minute. At the very, very sort of base of the lung tissue, there are the finest membranes because that's where gas exchange happens. So the arrow's pointing to the alveoli, of which there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands, and that's the site of gas exchange. So if you have a larger particle, this is that U-shaped structure that you see right there is an alveoli, sort of a diagram. Within that, you have, and again, researchers see this both in human studies and animal laboratory studies. When the particles are larger, they're deposited in that U shape, and they result in local inflammation. So some of the health outcomes, asthma, COPD, fibrosis, cancer. However, the finest particles don't get trapped in the U. They are, along with other gases like the oxygen we need when we inhale, they move into the capillary, which is that highway right below it. And from there, as the physician said, they are transported throughout our body and create systemic inflammation and result in a couple of the endpoints, which is arteriosclerosis, heart attack, and stroke. Some of the most interesting science that's been coming out now is not that wood smoke or wildfire smoke or diesel results in a heart attack. It may produce sticky blood in the arteries. It may produce the inflammation. So in other words, it's not just a trigger if you have heart disease, it may actually be causing heart disease. Just a few things about the respiratory system. It's actually one of the largest organs in our body. It stretches out over 1,500 miles. If you were to stretch it out, it would reach all the way from Seattle to Anchorage. It's a vast network, which is why we're so susceptible. At the end of that network, we have thousands of the tiny air sacs. If you were to lay them out flat, they would cover an entire tennis court or about 750 square feet. So when you're thinking about your susceptibility or that of your child or your parent or grandparent, fully developed lungs, and actually children's aren't necessarily fully developed, that is how much surface area is actually interfacing with the environment at any given time. That's a lot of exposure. Surprisingly, surface area of the lungs is actually 80 times greater than the surface area of an average size adult skin. It's designed to be that way. We're alive right now because within nanoseconds from the time we breathe, we have so much surface area that we've completely oxygenated our entire bloodstream. Cardiovascular outcomes. We'll talk a little bit about that. This was from a controlled study where they took individuals and they put them in a contained environment and exposed them to fine particle air pollution. And they were looking for systemic responses immediately. So again, this isn't chronic exposure or long-term. They wanted to know what was happening on a systematic level, on a system level with the body. So on the far left, on both sides, you have what was called your control, which is people breathing, quote, clean air. And on the right are those who were exposed, in which they were breathing a cocktail of PM, essentially. What you can see is blood pressure and heart rate were dramatically different from the control group to the exposed group. So the body has an immediate response to what is being inhaled. So epidemiological studies, which are essentially looking for causality and association, they have been, as the physician said, essentially particles of a certain size, and we now talk about PM 2.5, but this study itself is even almost 15 years old now. But even then they were saying, wow, it's those smaller particles that are associated with increased pulmonary and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. I happened to be in school, so I had to ask my professor a few years ago, so what's morbidity? Essentially, it means the illness, the burden of illness, is the amount of morbidity is how many people are experiencing asthma or COPD, as an example. In 2004, even with the early science, the American Heart Association said, you know what, air pollution is actually contributing to cardiovascular illness and mortality. And in 2010, they updated that to say even just short-term exposure can increase the risk of heart attack, stroke, arrhythmia, and heart failure in susceptible people. And again, that's 2010, and as we heard, the emerging science is now also that it may be creating and inducing heart disease in people who weren't susceptible initially. You heard about the analogy with cigarette smoke, right? Again, this particular is Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, webpage. Multiple researchers doing work there because of both non-attainment, and they also have quite a bit of refineries and air toxics issues in Salt Lake. But in their research, again, they looked at with cigarette smoke and said the effect can be almost immediate and chronic to even low concentrations of pollutant, and that they're associated with the acceleration of arteriosclerosis and significant arterial narrowing and stiffness. So that's pretty sobering to think that, you know, we're trying to eat right and we're trying to exercise, or we're trying to cut back on whatever our doctor has said is probably not good for us, but something outside our locus of control is potentially inducing heart disease in us or other things. So that's a little disturbing. This is a slide. It's, again, a little bit hard to see from where you are, but I like to use it because it demonstrates where ultrafine particles are seen and the development of plaque, which is what creates that arteriosclerosis. So in the red staining in the photos, you can see, first of all, on the far left is filtered air. In the middle is fine particles, and ultrafine particles are on the far right. The red staining that you see inside this aorta represents what's called lipid and macrophage content. And as you can see, the content is the highest and the inflammation is highest in those aorta that were exposed to the ultrafine particles. And it shows the highest degree of what they call plaque. Infectious outcomes. So, again, and I know you are all pretty familiar with the wood smoke issues, so the part that I found kind of surprising as I continue to do the work is how much the PAHs and the VOCs have effects on our immune system. When I was in that building, and it was in a wood smoke impacted area, the building was being condemned, I had 5 to 7 sinus infections a year. I was always on antibiotics. I was on steroids. My kids were premature, but I was sick all the time, and I couldn't get out of that cycle till I was out of that building and actually no longer working in that environment entirely. But I couldn't make the connection of why there might be immune suppression. I thought, well, it's a particle. It might be inducing something from a respiratory standpoint, but why would it have anything to do with the fact that I keep getting sick? And again, that's a personal anecdote. But what the researchers have found, and especially in children in particular, is where you have very high rates of upper and lower respiratory infections, which again are transitory. These are not asthma, but infections like RSV, they call it reactive airway disease, pneumonia, bronchitis. They're associated with exposure to wood smoke, but specifically to the constituents that are in the fine particle. In the PM 2.5. I work fairly closely with Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, specifically on indoor air, but some of their most recent research echoes what is seen in communities where you have very high levels of wood smoke. Is 1 in 4 Alaska Native babies are hospitalized each year. That's a very high rate. Over 50% of the children have a reactive airway disease, which is considered a precursor. It's what they call asthma before you can diagnose asthma at about the age 5. Bronchiectasis is a disease that's still common, and they have very high rates of invasive pneumococcal disease. A lot of these are infectious in nature, though. Not the asthma outcome, but their respiratory infections. The scientists say, well, what we think might be going on is the immune system is being suppressed by benzene in particular, which is a very strong constituent in wood smoke. As an example, again, this slide is, I believe this was Washington State, but this is in my Alaska counterparts. They have similar patterns. Under the age of 1, which is the very bottom bar, because on the far left, your column is going up in age, and across the right is the proportion in your population, but the highest proportion of hospitalizations. And the reason I'm talking about the Native communities that I work with is, as you know, many of them are very rural and low on the energy ladder. So there's an awful lot of wood heat being used, right? They have over 528 per 100,000 a rate of hospitalization. That's not for asthma, that's for infections. So again, the researchers are saying possibly because their young immune system can't handle the exposure to that much benzene and other PAHs. Again, This is kind of a long quote. I won't read it all, but another researcher saying that the particulates are probably hampering an immature immune system's ability to clear bacteria and other pathogens from the lung. All right, chronic exposure outcomes, because that's kind of our reality, right? Is whether it's wildfire, wood smoke, or we live next to a busy roadway, whatever it is, there's going to be issues that aren't short-term in nature. So let's talk about that for a little bit. I know from the comments that there's a lot of suspicion when something says EPA estimates. Sorry, EPA. You all know that too, right? What EPA is trying to do is be a channel and communicate from what they hear in the science. But again, I encourage you all, go ask EPA for the original paper and find out where they're getting that data and confirm it yourself. In this particular case, they are citing a study that says a single fireplace operating for an hour and burning 10 pounds of wood will generate 4,300 times more PAHs than 30 cigarettes. And as we heard, PAHs are carcinogenic. And of course, this depends on the species of wood and the moisture content and the combustion device and the ventilation in the house. Enormous number of variables. This is one particular researcher's finding in terms of the quantity of PAHs. Another study, I believe this one was done in Australia, found that the average level of PAHs were 300 to 500% higher in wood-burning homes. So why does the PAHs matter? Actually, I have this slide first. One thing that's interesting is certain species of types of air pollution have higher free radicals. And we all hear about free radicals because it's, for the last, 8-10 years, it's been the thing that we should take certain kind of vitamins or we should eat a certain way because we need to counteract all the free radicals that are, whether it's from sunshine or whether it's from air pollution or anything. Unfortunately, certain types of smoke are higher in free radicals than others. On the far right, actually coal smoke is the third and fourth columns there. Tobacco smoke is the furthest left. Then polluted air, which basically I'm assuming the researcher here is showing a mix of pollutants. When they isolate and look at wood smoke specifically, they found that the largest relative amount of PAHs was from wood smoke. And again, that probably comes back to not the smoke itself, but incomplete combustion of a carbon substance. So this slide, again, I like the visuals. Wood smoke particles are found to be more powerful than any other kind of air pollution in causing potentially cancerous changes to the DNA. And what you see here in this particular picture is the white area showing where cancer-causing wood smoke chemicals altered and damaged the DNA in lung cells. Cumulative risk. I have two more of these really depressing points. I'm sorry. So our cumulative risk. There's a couple issues, of course. Where we live is a factor. If we live near a roadway, and especially depending on where you are in Alaska, you may have road dust. If I'm down in Seattle, I may have diesel emissions. If I live next to a port, I'm going to have a combination of lots of different mobile emissions, mostly diesel. But that's going to be in addition to how I heat my home. The other factor in cumulative risk is you may have a certain exposure at home, but when you're at work all day, depending on where your workplace is or what you do or the ventilation, you're going to have a different set of exposure and different rate. And then again, rural versus urban. Many of the more rural tribal communities that I work with have egg burning and slash burning. Some of them have mines, there's industrial emissions, there's ports, in addition to the fact that many communities still need wood heat. So all of those things combined are part of the risk factor, and it's a difficult thing to get our heads around from a policy standpoint. Duration is also, of course, another factor in risk. It's a little blurry on my slide. I don't know what it shows on yours, but this demonstrates the prevalence of COPD by years of exposure to wood smoke. This is a 2016 article. And as you move from left to right, these are years of exposure. The blue column is essentially, I can't quite see. Let me put on my glasses. I think it's less than a year. Green is 10 years. The tan is greater, the purple is 20 to 29 years, and the yellow is greater than 30 years. My grandfather that I talked about, who burned everything, he died of emphysema. He also fought in World War II. Who knows what he was exposed to? But we know that he smoked. He burned wood every single day, all day. So for over 40 years, he died fairly young at 76. He may have been one of those statistics. We don't know. But again, like the statins and the prenatals, we're going back to the body of evidence is starting to say something fairly consistent. Again, major roadways, I just threw this in because it is an exacerbating factor. If you, essentially this is one example of heavy-duty vehicles. So let me point out that this is referring to mobile emissions, and in this case, because it's heavy-duty, it's diesel exhaust. But essentially, as you looked at what this particular research said, well, let's look at lung function and what's called FEV1, which is a measure of lung strength and capacity. Essentially, as you can see, there's an inverse relationship. So the closer you live to a major roadway, the lower lung function that you were demonstrated to have. Indoor-outdoor correlation, I'll take a few minutes in wrapping up to talk about this, kind of talk about what the data says and what are the determinants of higher or lower exposure. As you all know, there's not a bright line. What outdoors is indoors, essentially, because our homes, even though we try to make them airtight and energy efficient, there's going to be air exchange. The type of ventilation and air exchange depends on whether you have whole house ventilation or whether you have passive ventilation in your home or whether the windows have been sealed and airtight. But by and large, ambient air still consistently has a way of getting indoors. And most of the research says that, for example, in wood smoke impacted communities, levels are about inside your home are about 70% of what they are outdoors. So if it's 35 micrograms per cubic meter outside, it might be about 20, 21 inside your home. Unfortunately, that means there isn't really a safe space. There can, depending on ventilation or air filtration, it can help. What you can see here is this particular study looked at, I believe this was done in Canada, where they have, as you know, many wood smoke and wildfire issues. But they looked at residential infiltration of both fine and ultrafine particles. And as you can see, they found what's a positive correlation between both ambient and indoor. So on the left column is your outdoor, and on the inside is your ambient concentration. So as outdoor increased, so did the indoor level. I'm going to skip through that one. Again, there's just a little bit more of a way to illustrate the infiltration rates. I'm going to just wrap up by talking about some emerging science, and in part this is near and dear to me because watching my father pass with Alzheimer's and being sort of his primary support person right now, I just think it's a devastating disease, and so I'm very discouraged to see what the science is now saying about brain health and dementia. The video we watched was really powerful when he said that every single organ our blood goes to in our body is then transporting the PAHs and the benzene and the VOCs and the carcinogens. But the research hadn't really looked yet at brain health. There was a perception that the blood-brain barrier was sufficiently sealed that we weren't getting ultrafine particles in the brain. Unfortunately, now that's not known to be the case. What they are finding is it's not that it's through our bloodstream, it's through the nasal and olfactory pathways. So literally through our nose, we are mainlining fine particles. What the emerging evidence explains is that those ultrafine particles are being deposited in the brain and are associated with vascular dementia, which if you have a family member with that, you might have heard their physician talk about it. It's the kind of dementia that develops from a series of mini strokes, unlike Alzheimer's, which has a different fingerprint. But those two are associated with exposure to ultrafines because they're now seeing through imaging the ultrafine particles deposited in brain tissue. They're also noticing lower brain function in children. And those are they're looking in Mexico City and some of the highest exposure rates where they have a combination. This is not by any stretch, seeing deposits in children isn't something, I don't think the research has gone far enough yet to see where it is in other levels of air pollution, but in places like Beijing or Mexico City, they're seeing it affect children. This is really hard to read, but it really helped me understand the science when I was pulling this together. The way they describe it is that your nasal nerves, the hairs that are exposed to the outside air in your nose, I had no idea, they reach all the way to your brain. So, and this is a direct line, and it allows your nose to quickly communicate. So if you're out hunting, if you're cooking or if you're near my cooking, God forbid, and you smell burning, your body's immediate response is, okay, I can tell that something's out there or something's burning or something's dangerous. Evidently, we're designed that way for predator avoidance, right? But it also makes us susceptible to pollution. The particles enter your nose. They can actually travel along the olfactory neuron pathways from the nasal hairs right into your brain. And evidently, as this researcher said, it's why something like cocaine, when people inhale it through their nose, it goes directly into their brain. So, I'm just going to end with a few notes on burning practices that reduce risk. I'm not going to talk about policies, programs, or regulations. I do want to emphasize, however, there it is. Until this problem is solved by all of you, because I think, again, you're leading the nation in trying to come up with really challenging, difficult issues, but solutions, I strongly recommend filtration in your home. Most of the researchers are saying that if you put some kind of air cleaner or air filter in your home, you're getting 70 to 90% reduction, and those ultrafines too, depending on the proper MERV filter you're using. So you're potentially lowering your risk from any particles in your home, but also if you're burning and your wood stove isn't performing optimally for some reason, or your neighbor's burning, or they have a hydronic heater and it's inefficient, you're reducing your risk because that particular filter is absorbing a lot of the ultrafines. So that's my only word in terms of action that I want to end with. And frankly, my goal is that statins and prenatals are recommended, and someday so are air filters. Absolutely, for every pregnant woman, every individual, when they say, do you smoke? Then they also ask them, where do you live? Oh, okay, well, good, get an air filter. Until it's resolved, get an air filter and put it in your home, put it in your bedroom. There's no reason we need to live, again, watching my father with Alzheimer's, watching my mom COPD, watching my kids asthma. We don't need that. It sucks. They're horrible diseases. All right, those are my contact information. I think that's it. I will add, this year I put all of my references on these slides because I noticed that this was available. So this is all of the data that was used, but any questions you have about any of this science, please contact me and I'll link you with the specific references. So, thank you.
Okay, do you want to make your way to that page?
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you, Gillian. We are at a point in our program where we're going to have the speakers, the first three speakers, come up to the table here. Wendy and Jennifer, if you want to come up. It's a time for the audience to maybe engage the speakers at maybe a little more deeper level, maybe unpack some of the presentations they made a little bit more, some in-depth questions. The presentations were pretty much just listening to the presentations focused on kind of a first level look at maybe the health impacts of PM 2.5 and maybe some of the boots on the ground economic impacts. So what I'd like to do is, I got a couple of questions already, and I think folks knew it was coming, but if you didn't get the memo, on your table there are some white cards. If you've got a question about one of the presenters or for one of the presenters, write that question down and hand it to Lenine. You can have Todd, Nick, raise your hand, Nick, or Todd. Todd, are you back there someplace? Right back there. If you guys can kind of like get questions and funnel them up our way, and I'll sort them out and kind of keep them on target here and on track. But we have about 40 minutes for the audience to engage the last three panel speakers before we move on to our next presentation. So while questions are coming in and I'm kind of organizing questions, I'm going to ask the first question to kind of kick this off. So you ladies ready to go? Okay, so first question. And we'll start with Gillian first and go down the trail there. So from your perspective and from your presentation's perspective, why should Fairbanks care about the PM 2.5 problem that we're having? Gillian.
I mean, I think you're all answering that by showing up. I mean, that's a really tough question. I think the data, the science says it's harmful, but you're providing the solutions to an economic, a social, a home heating, a comfort issue, a health issue. So I guess I would say that's probably not my place to answer, except that I see observations of it being done. And just to say, I'm glad I'm here. I just about electrocuted myself. I turned my water upside down over the mic. So glad to still be here. Sorry.
Well, I think most of us, if we weren't born here, we moved here because we love the great outdoors and we wanted a safe, healthy place to live. And right now, Fairbanks and North Pole are not safe for some major portions of the year for the kinds of activities that Alaskans treasure. You know, we've been working on this for almost 10 years. We're 8 years into a 10-year mandatory improvement. I can't find the right terms. We have to improve our air. We were given 10 years to do that. We have 2 years left, and our community will be facing major sanctions, which means that all of us will be paying more for services, essential services like electricity and things like that. So, you know, the community is going to have to pay one way or the other, and I think, and we're paying in ways right now that for health care that isn't really showing up anywhere. So I want Fairbanks to be a safe, healthy place to live as Alaskans, and I think we can do that.
Wendy?
I think Fairbanks and North Pole should definitely care about the PM 2.5 because there are members of our community that are affected when PM 2.5 climbs during inversions. I don't think that that's a question. I think that's a fact that people are affected negatively with air quality. The question and the problem is that it's a very difficult thing to solve because of the fact of our economic situation. There are only two choices of heat right now in our area. You can pay for fuel or you can pay for wood. Wood is extremely cheap, and if you do it yourself, it's free. It's your labor and your time. And we are asking our community to give up the only source of heat that they have in order to protect other members of our community. And while that is a good thing and a good thing to strive for, we're also hurting that section of the community that we are asking, and frankly, we're not asking, we're making them. And the fact that it is a force issue instead of a voluntary issue is one of the reasons that the wood burning community pushed back, because there isn't an available solution. Until there is an available solution, the wood smoke is going to be a problem. The people who burn have to have another source that is not going to bankrupt them and is not going to leave their house cold. So I think the solution is getting other options of heating fuel or other options into our area. I think one of those options is the ESPs that really need to be looked into strongly. Those will allow wood burners to burn their wood stoves efficiently and correctly and reduce emissions greatly.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. So the next question from our audience, I'm doing my best to direct it to the right person, so I'm going to direct this one to Jennifer. So based on your experience in Fairbanks and the many years in your work with Dr. Hanley, what are some of the real and tangible health effects from pollution that we're seeing on the ground right here in Fairbanks right now?
Well, as I said, there aren't a lot of epidemiological studies that are done in communities the size of Fairbanks. You know, we do have the one that was done, unfortunately, 10 years ago that showed that hospital admissions increase. You know, for cardiac events and strokes following a rise in PM 2.5 air pollution. We do know that. You know, we also know if you call a pharmacy to see if they have respiratory inhalers at the time when, you know, the air quality is poor, they are scrambling to get enough respiratory inhalers up here. You know, the emergency inhalers and the preventative inhalers like Advair. But you know, physicians do see more people. I remember talking to one of the physicians cardiologist who is no longer in Fairbanks. He's moved on to Anchorage, but he was here for about 6 years. And the first year he was here, I was over at the Porter Heart Center, and he said, you know, I'm not used to seeing so many young people with arrhythmias. So there's a lot of anecdotal data, but honestly, a lot of people, including healthcare providers, have not made the connection. You know, and when Dr. Hanley and I talked to the physicians at Tanana Valley Clinic, he said, you know, how many of you are seeing people who are affected by air pollution? And he didn't ask them to raise their hands, but he said, I'm hoping that at the end of the talk, you might be thinking, oh, maybe the people I'm seeing with this problem or this problem or this problem, maybe it's being exacerbated by their exposure to PM 2.5 air pollution. You know, every physician in town is seeing people with, you know, inflammatory bowel disease, cancers or repeated cancers, you know, diabetes. Just, you know, you look at the data, this is a, you know, a body-wide, system-wide inflammatory process. And it's really just hitting home with healthcare providers now that they are seeing people, I think, with PM 2.5 related health issues.
So Jennifer, just a follow-on question, or maybe a statistic if you have it real briefly. This came in just a second ago. To your knowledge, and this is a question I get in the mayor's office quite often, how many deaths per year are caused by PM 2.5 in the Fairbanks North Star Borough?
We'd love that data. We talked to Dr. Jay Butler. I don't have that with me right now, but you know, you can extrapolate from national studies. We talked to Dr. Butler about that, and you know, of even getting this hospital visit study redone. They've lost 90 positions in public health. They have one person in the toxicology section of public health. So, you know, I don't know whether we're going to get that. We can extrapolate from other areas that have high PM 2.5 air pollution, but honestly, we've been the highest in the country. So even if we extrapolated from their data, ours might be worse.
So another question for Jennifer. I know we're
Jeez.
picking on you a little bit here. So it sounds like we need to do more work on studies and kind of some more research to kind of sort out the data and get more information, which is always good. What, in your opinion or your expertise, do you think would it take to get that done, to get the information that we need to answer those questions? Maybe Gillian, in your experience, also maybe as a follow-on.
Well, I'd just like to say, as I did right after Dr. Hanley's talk, we don't need additional health data done here to move on this issue, to make some changes in our community. I mean, it is well studied, and how it affects the body is no different in Fairbanks, except that we may be a little, you know, have a few more clothes on, but it isn't really any different than how it would affect the body elsewhere. It could be, you know, we know that the wood smoke particulates are very spiky. They're very small, but they're also very spiky, as opposed to some other PM 2.5 particulates. And Dr. Munch, who came up from Salt Lake City, said they are the most dangerous ones because they're spiky and you can't get them out of your lungs. Maybe Jillian would have more to say about that, but we don't need, you know, more data is always good, but we don't need more studies to take some action in our community.
May I?
Absolutely.
Were you going to answer?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. I would like to question and or point out how health is cumulative, as in everything that we do, from what we eat to what we breathe to how we exercise, plays in our health. I'm not an expert. You obviously are, and you guys have way more time and knowledge on this, but I'm wondering how much lifestyle choices play into health. what we eat, the amount of processed foods that we eat, the amount of TV that we watch, the amount of sedentary lifestyles that we have. Even here in Alaska, where we pride ourselves on being active, there are an incredible amount of people, children, young, old, that don't move. So how much are we looking at overall health versus the only thing about breathing the air? That's important. But I think that when we're talking about these numbers and the effects that wood smoke have on people from pre-birth on, we miss out on the fact that there are hundreds of other factors that play in our overall health. And while this is an important one, I think the other health factors shouldn't be overlooked.
I'll just add, I appreciate your observation, and I think it's absolutely correct that, as I showed on my slide, our gender, our age, our diet, our genetics, and our behaviors are all key variables. So my question would be, do we want a tipping point? What we know in the science is that a certain amount of exposure, either acute or long-term, is a tipping point for some in the induction of cancer or a stroke or a heart attack. And my sense is, can we remove that tipping point? Because it's really hard for us, as we know, to remove some of the other things, like to become more active, to be less sedentary, to get our kids outside more. Those are tough things. But if we can remove that tipping point, then maybe we can save some more lives.
I'd just also like to say that a really good, well-performed study takes all of those other things into effect. What's the right word? they have similar sample sizes. They're taking into consideration how many of these people in these groups are smoking, how many exercise, how many have diabetes, how many have they have controls. And so really, when it comes right down to it, they're saying if all of these other things are equal, the thing that has made a difference in the health issues or deaths, morbidity or deaths in these two groups are that these people were exposed to smoke and these people were not. And I was diagnosed 18 months ago with breast cancer, and the first thing I said to my doctor was, I didn't expect this. I've raised my own food, raised my own chickens. We hunt and fish for, game, and have a garden, and I think I eat pretty healthfully. I smoked when I was a teenager, and everybody in my family smoked, but I said, I didn't expect this. And she said, well, maybe you would have gotten it earlier if you hadn't done all those things. And so, leading a healthy life can take you so far, but there are some things you can't control. And that's the difference, I think. We can't control the air. We can control what we put in it, but if we're walking around in town, other than wearing a mask all the time, which doesn't look very good in your community, we can't control what we're breathing in.
Okay, thank you. So Gillian, this question's for you, and I'm going to try to combine 2 or 3 cards into one question here for efficiency. But basically, it speaks to some of the comments you made about practices and behaviors around our burning practices and how we operate our devices. Can you speak more about indoor, outdoor air quality and kind of some distinguishable characteristics between how we operate and what the differences are, and then what is air filtration? I mean, speak more to that about what that does for kind of leveling that off inside the household or workspace.
There's a lot of experts in this room that could speak about the combustion of the device and the operation and your fuel and your moisture content, but those are all variables into how much, especially the device itself, comes back into the room through backdrafting and through, whether the glass is broken and the seals and the gaskets haven't been maintained. So those are all factors into how much stays within the house versus how much is actually going up through the flue. That said, even if it's going out of the flue, if it's heavy and if there's an inversion, it's sitting and hovering near your home and being pulled back into your home because of the stack effect. So unfortunately, when we heat our house, as many of you know, the heat creates a stack effect, which means that the hot air is pulled up and cold air from outside is then pulled in through every interstitial space in that house, in the foundation. So we're kind of creating almost a closed loop system sometimes. So I think the question of indoor and ambient, yeah, the operation of the device, again, there's many variables into how much of it is going to stay in your home, especially if you're someone like I was 20 years ago who kept the stove door open. And had it incomplete combustion. Filtration, I'm happy to answer anyone who has specific questions, but pretty significant reduction both in the particulates and in the measurable VOCs and carbon monoxide and some of the key combustion gases. So what's good is to see is that it can be highly effective in reducing all the different key risk components of wood smoke inside the home. Did that answer your question?
It's not my question.
Oh, your
I would like to
composite.
input some too. I have a small filtration system. I don't know what kinds there are for whole house or whatever, but I have a small room one. It's in our living room. Our wood stove is in the living room. And we bought it probably a year after we had the wood stove, just because I knew it was a good thing to have. I think as part of sort of the governmental powers that are trying to get air cleaned up and working on all of these things, that should be a viable option for people who are severely affected, who go out. If we're having such a hard time and we're working so hard at getting the air cleaned up, then there should be a way for those people who are severely affected to get help from the borough in the form of masks and when they go outside, if that's a necessary thing, or filters for their home, so that we as the community continue to work on ways to allow people to burn and clean air at the same time, and those that are affected can also have some relief in their own homes. I think that would be a good way to spend borough funds or EPA funds if it were allowed.
Okay, so before we switch gears, last question generally about health. To all three panelists, and starting with Wendy first, how can we get the medical community in our town more involved with this issue?
That one's a little difficult for me because I'm focused more on trying to get wood burners to burn responsibly and be allowed to burn without punitive damages. I don't know how to answer that question because, I mean, unless data is specifically collected on every individual that comes into our facility, whether it be in the emergency room or first care or an actual visit to THC, and I don't think it would be, well, it would be hard, but I mean, wouldn't have to have invasive data, you know, date or age of the person, sex of the person, what kind of symptoms they have, and that would sort of allow a larger database to look at maybe trying to narrow down what made a person sick and what made them come into the ER. I think that's it.
Okay, Jennifer?
One of the reasons that Dr. Hanley and I have targeted talking to healthcare providers is, number one, a lot of this research is fairly new. Number two, many of them didn't have much education and still don't in medical school about environmental health factors. You know, oftentimes people don't know how to bring up uncomfortable topics in talking to patients. It took, you know, as I said, 50 years ago we knew that lung cancer was caused by smoking. And then it took a while before people realized that heart disease was also caused by smoking. And then another 10 years before people started realizing that other things like diabetes and stuff was made worse with smoking. Secondhand smoke and stuff like that, and the fact that it's an inflammatory process. Doctors have 10 to 15 minutes to talk to you. They hate to open a can of worms. You know, and when we talked to them, we gave them a very quick little questionnaire. You know, would it be helpful to have posters in the waiting room? Would it be helpful to have small posters in the exam room? Would it be helpful to have handouts? You know, what would you use? You know, we didn't want to develop anything even, you know, that wasn't going to be used and just sit in a pile. And they were very receptive to that kind of information. As I said, you can't say if somebody has a heart attack, your heart attack is because of this. What we can say with all this megadata is we see higher rates of heart attack, stroke, arrhythmia, on and on and on and on. And in communities that have high rates of air pollution. Where do you live in your community? How do you heat your house? As soon as they ask, how do you heat? Maybe somebody's going to get defensive. Or they'll say, well, where do I get a good air filtration system? And doctors don't want to be talking to their patients about air filtration. They've only got 10 to 15 minutes. So they also wanted, good, maybe a pamphlet where they could refer people to getting information about air filtration. Now, we have air filtration in our house because of health problems we want to protect against. But I'd rather have clean air. If we try to air filtration systems are not cheap. I think it's good to maybe help clean up the air for our most vulnerable citizens, but why not just clean up the air for everybody?
Gillian?
I remembered what I was going to say, speaking of cognitive decline. I remember what I was going to say to your question prior, so I have to come back to that. And the question was, how can we ascertain whether or not that wood smoke is inducing specific health outcomes here in Fairbanks, and at what level and with how many people? One thing I wanted to mention in international studies, there's two measures they use. They're somewhat invasive, but a human being will, when you exhale, there's something called carboxyhemoglobin. It's present in your exhaled breath, and it's present in your urine, it's present in the hair follicle. They use that in international studies because in homes that use cook stoves, extremely high levels of PM and VOCs. So it is one biological metric that you can use to determine exposure. I don't know that that level of invasive type of study would be done here, but it is certainly done in some countries for that reason. There's another metric, subclinical, called exhaled nitric oxide, or exhaled NO. It's a marker of inflammation in the airways. That's another one that's sometimes done as screening for or asthma or inflammation. So there are mechanisms for actually assessing extent of exposure. And I'm not an exposure scientist, so these are just my knowledge of what has been done in some research. To answer the question about getting physicians, I think the trick with clinical medicine is they're designed to treat symptoms. You go to the doctor, not really preventively. I don't know about you, but I certainly don't. I go when I have a symptom or a problem, right? And medicine is designed to treat the symptom. And if you get to that point, you're no longer in the preventive funnel. You're now in the, let me give you some medication to treat the symptoms and maybe slow the course of this, but I usually can't stop or arrest it. So when you're in that level, clinical medicine isn't necessarily going to help us prevent Alzheimer's, dementia, and arteriosclerosis, right? They're going to give us a prescription, and they're probably going to give us a handout about some things that we could do. So preventive side of it, honestly, I would like to see payers. I would like to see Medicaid and Medicare and private insurers saying, what's going to keep my client and my patient out of the hospital, out of the ER, out of going to the doctor regularly? Wow, look at that. The science says clean air would reduce the number, very clearly reduce the number of ER visits they would have annually, reduce the number of times they need their Advair controller medication refilled. I would like to invest, instead of putting the money into that medication, the payer saying, I'd like to put filtration in the home. I'd like to help supply briquettes to that pregnant woman. I'd like to help with filtration, control of wood species content. It's crazy, but if I were a payer and watching how much I pay for certain people, why wouldn't you say, this is medicine? Let's just do this.
Okay.
Thanks.
So let's transition real quick to some of the economic issues around this. And I see Jim Dodson in the audience here. I know he's going to give us a pretty good presentation on that later in probably more depth. But the transition question is the relationships between economics and health impacts. And so let me be more direct in that question. From the cost of heating oil or the cost of wood or natural gas, that perspective, talk to us about the health, the impacts on those economic trade-offs when it comes to understanding the cost of stroke or bronchitis or asthma to a family. Talk to us a little bit about those trade-offs. And Gillian, I know you've done a lot of research on that. Maybe you can go first.
Every municipality is different, but you know, average $385 is what is billed for a in-office visit. You know, $980 a day for or per ER visit. You know, $1,800 a night if you're staying. 3-day hospitalization is $9,000. That varies by where you are in the United States and what the reimbursement rate is. But there is, I certainly can't answer at the larger scale, but yeah, there's a very clear, and it goes back to the payers. There's a very clear correlation between the burden, economic burden of paying for and treating those symptoms once we get to that point where we're in trouble and have to go to the ER. One brief anecdote, my mom was uninsured, you know, probably for about 6 or 7 years and couldn't afford her asthma COPD controller medication. It was $395 and she couldn't afford it, and she didn't tell me, and I probably, of course, would have helped her out. So she stopped taking it, and within 7 days she was in the ER, and she was then hospitalized and spent 2 nights. So she then ended up paying, I think, like $4,200 because she couldn't pay the $390 for the controller medication. So there's major expenses. It just has to be calibrated for where you are in the United States.
Alaska is well known as having some of the highest health care costs in the country. It's very hard to get insurance companies to bid to become providers in Alaska. I have a fear that if they started looking at our air PM 2.5 particulates and air quality up here, that they might not bid. And we'd be in really big trouble if nobody wanted to cover people here or started increasing costs because of our, and I would ask the people in EPA whether there have been any studies of healthcare insurance costs going up in areas where the air pollution is high. But what happens is when people have a lot of chronic diseases and are overusing or using their health care a lot for repeat sinus infections, for very expensive medications, for asthma, for inflammatory bowel disease and things like that, is the cost is shifted to other people. So if you don't have health insurance, then it's shifted to another insurance company. I mean, you know, that's been well known for about 30 years. So we're all paying one way or the other. There are no inexpensive medications for some of these major health problems. You know, getting a pacemaker put in at Providence Hospital costs $105,000. You know, my husband had a 9-hour procedure for ventricular arrhythmias in San Francisco, and that was almost $100,000. So, you know, you guys are paying. We had insurance. It's shifted to everyone else whose insurance rates go up. And there are some people who don't have insurance or have really minimal insurance, and so they put off getting care, and then they end up, you know, in the hospital with you know, serious exacerbations and then maybe going on oxygen. And you talk about monthly costs for oxygen as well. But I'm really more concerned about, you know, lifelong impacts. If kids are exposed when they're young, but the effects don't show up until they're, you know, 50 or 60, you're not going to make that connection. I mean, I had a lot of exposure to smoke when I was a child growing up in a smoking household. And, you know, my cancer didn't show up until my 60s. So making those connections is very difficult in a mobile society. You know, it can be done, but it's really hard. Our population here, we have people moving in and out. You know, our population, 25% every year, our population changes. It's a hard area to do studies.
One of the reasons that I did my presentation on expectation versus reality is because there is only so much that we can expect our residents, both those who want to breathe clean air and those who want to burn wood, to do. One of the things I wrote in my presentation is that we can only do the best with what we have available. That's it. We can't ask residents to do more than what they are trying to do, which is their absolute best. Residents who are trying to heat their homes with wood are doing the absolute best with what they have available. There is no other choice for them. If you are found to be burning irresponsibly, or if you are found to be a bad burner, then the borough should absolutely hold you accountable for those things. But because we are in the area that we are in, and because of our current economic status, people are doing the only thing they can, the best that they can, with what the options they have available to them. Talking about these health risks, it's sort of a little daunting because I'm not a health expert. What I do know is the facts of our community. We're talking about the costs of getting yourself healthy because of PM 2.5, where I feel heavily that because healthcare is so expensive, it is now the wood burners' fault because other people can't afford healthcare. And I can't stress it enough, there isn't another option. How are we asking wood burners to give up the only source of heat they have so that other people aren't paying exorbitant healthcare costs? So the opposite end of that is now people are broke. They're going bankrupt, they're losing their houses are being frozen up because they're not allowed to heat with wood. I mean, it's sort of the same with health costs. So we're asking wood burners, and again, we're forcing wood burners to take on all of these other expenses that they didn't have before. And it's not fair to the wood burner, it's not fair to the community who are trying to do their absolute best and work within the confines of our reality to make the air better and stay warm.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to combine another set of questions here, so hang with me for a second. So this is to Wendy and Gillian. And so Wendy, in your presentation, and Gillian, maybe speak to this question, from your experience working with tribes and other rural communities. Wendy, in your presentation, you mentioned the economic hardship process was overburdensome. And a kind of a follow-on question that I got in here was, how should the borough or whoever's regulating our PM 2.5 problem deal with like a no ashes, when there's obviously a household or a business that has the economic resources, e.g. they got a float plane in their front yard or a very nice house, many cars, that kind of, they have the economic resources to switch to another fuel source, but they're claiming a no ash exemption. How should we handle that as a borough, as a community?
I don't think that it is any of the borough's business what a person's economic status is. I think it is the borough's business to know how well they can operate their stove. If the borough is patrolling and finds someone burning incorrectly and they have 5 four-wheelers and a float plane in the yard, they should be punished just as well or just as much as if they find somebody burning irresponsibly who has 3 broken cars in the yard. Economic status doesn't have anything to do with the operation of a stove. It shouldn't be brought in. It isn't anybody's business what my economic status or any wood burner's economic status is, because that has no bearing whatsoever on where and how a person heats their stove. And the fact that that's brought forward is just sort of another hammer. People burn wood mainly because it's a cheaper source of fuel. And if they're not allowed to do so until they have proven that they are poor, it is a burden that should not be placed on people. It shouldn't. There are rights inherent to people. They want to be able to feel safe and secure and not feel like the government is invading their privacy. And doing these things, requiring no ashes with financial caveats, breaks a person open, and it's just something that I think is not the borough's business and shouldn't be asking questions of.
Okay, Gillian, from that question and from your experience, how have other communities kind of handled this delicate little apple cart of issues here?
Really tough question. I don't know that we know the answer. I respect what you're saying, Wendy. I think it's I don't know what the answer is, but maintaining a stove, upgrading a stove, having a supply of cured dried wood, those do require some money and some time. And sometimes people have 2 jobs, sometimes they have 3 jobs. So there is an economic piece tied to good burning. So even if you can't afford to switch, sometimes you can't even afford to maintain the stove, or again, the gaskets and seals are failing, but you haven't done that because you've got too many other things on your plate. So I think there's a major economic factor. I'm totally skirting the question of what the right answer is, but I think economics are tied to how you burn and what you burn. I will say on a very practical level, one of the things I've seen in tribal communities that I really appreciate is LIHEAP, which is the Low Income Heating and Assistance Program, now allows the program, anyone who qualifies, you can have your stove maintained, you can have it serviced. In some states, LIHEAP is allowed to exchange your device, and the thing most exciting to me is you can actually, I believe it was in Montana, one of the tribes, purchase briquettes. And as you all know, sort of 1 quart of briquettes is worth, or you may not know, 1 quart of a briquette or a compressed wood log puts out about the same BTUs as 2.5 cords of wood. So they will purchase through LIHEAP dollars briquettes for that household. So even if they have a poor functioning device, you're burning a very, very less than 1% moisture content wood supply and reducing emissions. I think there are examples of what's done. Again, LIHEAP, you have to income qualify, but there are solutions.
Okay.
Could I make a comment
Yes,
along this line? I'm involved with the stakeholders group, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow afternoon. You know, some of the discussion, and boy, there's been a lot all summer long. But members of that group, all of us, are really concerned about the economic hardship that some of the requirements would have for people. And what we're hearing and what the borough's been hearing for the past 10 years is, you know, people want to burn wood for economic reasons because it's relatively cheap. And you can't use that argument and then say that the borough shouldn't be involved in, you know, knowing what people are making if they are requesting assistance for either a new stove or a filtration system, which they don't provide coverage for or anything right now. But, you know, one of the recommendations that may come out from the stakeholders group is we really felt it was important to prioritize people who would have economic hardship, trying to meet the requirements that would enable them to reduce their PM 2.5 pollution, you know, what they're putting into the atmosphere. And people felt that that was really important. And one group that I'm very worried about, having done a lot of work in the villages in the interior for the past 30 years, is that, you know, in 2008 when oil prices went up, there were a lot of people who had to move from villages along the rivers in the interior into Fairbanks because they couldn't afford the $8 a gallon out in the villages. And most of those families were used to wood heat in the villages, and that's what they're using also in Fairbanks. And so I feel like that group is going to be kind of disenfranchised twice. You know, their lifestyle is going to be disenfranchised twice. But it's important that we not forget, you know, if there is an economic hardship, then for some people, disproportionately to others, they may need more help in meeting the requirements. And I don't know what other way to get around that as to, you know, if somebody's making $120,000 a year and somebody's making $30,000, should they get the same amount of help in switching out their stoves? That's the kind of questions that the stakeholders group has been, you know, grappling with.
Okay, so we have about 2 minutes left, and this is the last question, and I thank the audience for the thoughts, because there's a ton of good thoughts here. The last question, and I'm going to call on Audible on this and try to combine some other cards. So the conversation in our community, especially in social media and other circles, and I'll quote this off the card, has been quite vitriolic. And we hear it in the mayor's office, too, quite often. Bottom line, what is getting in the way of our community dealing with this problem? Obviously, there's different points of view on it, but what is getting in the way of us dealing with this as a community? And Gillian, from your experience, you go first.
I really hesitate as a non-member of the community to weigh in. Having read all of it, I don't see indifference, and I think that's a good sign. I mean, I think if there was indifference, you wouldn't be working towards solutions. Yeah, people are angry and they distrust and they're concerned, but they're writing in and they're showing up to meetings, and with leaders like Wendy, they're having part of the discourse and the debate. So I think there is progress. I think changes in major complex issues take decades, actually. So if there was indifference and there were no comments written in and this was going on, that's where I think there would really be a problem.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
Can you repeat the question?
So summarizing the question, the community conversation is quite ugly at times about this issue. What's holding us back from solving the problem?
Okay. As I said right after Dr. Hanley's talk, I think this, got off the block as a discussion between regulation and, non-regulation. It's kind of rather than, we've got a health problem in our community. Can we make it better? And everybody's going to have to compromise. There have been tremendous compromises in some of the discussions we've been having in the stakeholders group. This is a local problem, and I think we have local solutions. We're getting a lot of help from people in Washington, and not as much at the state level because of budget constraints and stuff. But that's one of the reasons I think it's very important that the borough have local control. And almost every discussion in the stakeholders group, people have said, no, we've got to Fairbanks-size that. That's not going to work for Fairbanks. We need to Fairbanks-size it. And if we want to Fairbanks-size some of the regulations, some of the recommendations, some of the changes that we hope people will make, we need local control.
Wendy, you get the last bite of the apple.
Thank you. I think that being able to listen and hear what other people are saying is the most important part of this whole thing. I strongly feel that many of the people in the burning community feel unheard, and they feel that their concerns about how to economically heat their home are not being heard. The original rules that were come up with last year, I do believe, did not involve a member of the wood-burning community that lived in the non-attainment area. It's very easy to make rules that other people have to follow. We are making strides at getting wood burners actually involved in the process, but right now it was pretty slim. So being able to talk to people that you don't agree with in a manner that you can be heard is important. And I've tried to do that very hard on the Facebook page and just in the way that I communicate with people. I have communicated angrily at times, but I do believe that I have done so with respect. It's important to note that I firmly believe that curtailment for this community is not a viable option, at least complete curtailment. There isn't another option available, and until there is another option available for heating sources, curtailment is going to be a failed endeavor. I firmly believe that we do not have local control, we have local enforcement. Local control would be that we are allowed to institute ESPs and not spend money to study ESPs. We are not allowed to do certain things that involve backsliding because we have EPA and DEC's rules that we have to follow. The Fairbanks size it is a great quote, but I don't believe that EPA and DEC are going to allow us to Fairbanks size things because they have these regulatory rules that have to be followed. And some of those regulatory rules are not compatible with our area and our economic status. I really want to keep the lines of communication open, and I really want the people who don't live here and don't experience our winters to think very strongly about how people have to do what they will do in order to stay warm. And we have to find other solutions that do not involve forcing people off of wood heat and punishing them if they don't follow those rules responsibly. And that's it.
Okay, well, thank you, ladies, for your expertise and your time on our panel. We duly appreciate it. On behalf of Mayor Castle and the Mayor's Office, thank you for your time. We really do appreciate it. So we're going to pivot real quick into our next presentation. I see our presenter lurking in the background over here. Let me do the intro real quick. So this is the last presentation we'll do right before we break for lunch. And Nick, you're going to get I'll cut you off when we get close. Let me introduce Nick real quick. Nick Zarnecki is the Fairbanks North Star Borough Air Quality Manager, a position he has held since March of 2017. Nick has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Wyoming and 15 years of air quality experience. Prior to his position with the Fairbanks North Star Borough, he led the air quality group at Lohman Walsh LLC, a consulting firm here in Fairbanks, managing multiple projects spanning major and minor source permitting, NEPA and compliance assistance, emission inventory preparation, and ambient air quality monitoring. Nick also worked for the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, Air Quality Division in compliance and enforcement for 9 years, where he was responsible for inspecting a wide variety of industrial emission sources to ensure compliance with state and federal air quality regulations. So please welcome Nick Zarnecki to the podium. And we need to turn his slides on. Do we have our AV tech person? Here we go.
All right, so while we're waiting for the slides to start, I just wanted to take a moment and thank our first three speakers for their presentation and also for sitting up on the panel discussion, because that's always difficult to do. And I think they did a very good job of framing the issue that we have, that, this is primarily a public health issue, and the largest contributor is wood smoke emissions. And also, we live in the coldest climate in the U.S., and a substantial portion rely on wood heat to make it through the winter. And so there's really, two issues there that make this a very complex, multifaceted problem where there is no easy solution. I think that's really well illustrated by the fact that we're 9-10 years into this issue and it still hasn't been solved. And so a potential solution has been proposed that would allow burning and, hopefully clean up the air. And those are ESPs, or, a broader category would be retrofit control devices. And so basically, hey, what's the problem, government? Why haven't we embraced this? And why haven't we moved forward? And, is this technology really a silver bullet? And so that's kind of what I'm going to be discussing today, is the work that we've done on the local level with these devices and some of the challenges that we face and how they can fit into a potential solution. And before I jump into some of the stuff, I do want to clear up one perception, is that we've heard that, ESPs are illegal. Why won't the borough allow ESPs? There is absolutely nothing stopping folks from going out and purchasing an ESP and putting it on their wood stove. The only thing is that, right now there's no government subsidy to pay for it. And up until last week, there was no exemption from the curtailment program, so no, sort of incentive to do it. But there's nothing out there preventing folks from taking a look at this new technology, trying it out, and doing their part to help clean up the air. And so there's a lot of words on these slides. They're very boring. I'm going to breeze through some of these, but I wanted to put it there so that when it's posted online that folks can take a look at it. There are a lot of particulate control technologies out there that address the emissions coming out of the stack. I kind of broke it down into two categories. You have combustion controls that rely on increasing the combustion efficiency, and those will allow more complete combustion and less pollution, less PM 2.5 out of the combustion process. These kind of broken up into things like tube stoves that improve it, and then catalytic controls that reduce emissions by passing these through a ceramic catalyst, and then it allows complete combustion to happen at lower temperatures. And then we have post-combustion control devices. These are the electrostatic precipitators, the ESPs, fabric filters, wet scrubbers, and mechanical collectors. These are all widely used in industrial applications. ESPs, they function on a simple technology of passing the pollution stream over an electrode. It charges it just like you would, you know, a balloon that you, as a kid, when you rub it on your head and stick it to a wall. And then electrostatic forces pull the particle to the chimney stack. Fabric filters, it's like a vacuum cleaner. Passes it through a filter, cleans it out. Wet scrubbers, you have basically fine droplets that run counterflow to the exhaust stream. It grabs onto the PM 2.5 and it precipitates them out. Mechanical collectors are cyclones, and they swirl it around and use centrifugal force to pull some of the particle pollution out. There's a bunch of slides here that go into some of those technical details that will be posted online for folks that are interested in those. And so I think one of the biggest questions is, now that this technology that is in all those technologies that I talked about are based on industry, so they're larger sources, things like power plants, that those have been utilized. And so there are some of these pieces of the technology that are being scaled down for use in homes. And it's a very, very good idea and a good movement, but it does come with a couple of issues. And what I wanted to do on these slides is talk about what the borough has done at the local level to try to implement these technologies into their current control plan. And so the Borough Assembly passed Ordinance 2018-06 last week, and this is not a control measure, but what this is an exemption to the curtailment program, because we have, you know, the Borough Assembly has heard from the community that the curtailment program is onerous, it's difficult to comply with, and so the Assembly wanted to do something at the local level where we have this control program. And so they approved an exemption to the curtailment program for approved retrofit control devices. The Borough Assembly made this broader than just ESPs, because there's really a few limited manufacturers for ESPs, and you know, as the government, we never want to endorse one single manufacturer, but make it a broad category so it's applicable to any new technology that comes along. Some of the things in the ordinance are that the ESP has to meet an emission threshold, and that emission threshold is going to be conducted through laboratory testing, and there were several categories defined. It's pellet stove, catalytic stove, and non-catalytic stove. And so what the ordinance says is that if you take and send a retrofit control device, say an ESP, and test it with a pellet stove, and you run through the laboratory testing, then that will be an approved retrofit control device, and it can be installed and have exemptions to the curtailment program. And the same would apply for the other three categories. I want to highlight this here, that just the amount of work that it took to be able to list those three categories up there was quite substantial. And it was a lot of technical work with the borough and DEC and our partners at EPA working to figure out what a proper testing protocol would be. Because currently, the way that everything is structured is that all of the certified wood devices, every single make and model goes to a laboratory and gets tested. Every single make and model. And if we were to run along that same framework and you had to test a retrofit control device along with every single make and model, it would be a huge resource to get that testing done, and it would take a lot of time. And so EPA worked with us very closely in a very quick time frame to develop a protocol that could be broadly applied to these categories, and it would allow a quicker implementation. And I think that's some of the behind-the-scenes work that never really gets seen. And so the approved RCD appliance combination, it exempts the the device and the retrofit control device from a stage 1 and stage 2 burn restriction, and they're allowed to burn up to 55 micrograms per meter cubed. As a reminder, stage 1 is at 25, stage 2 is at 35. So that provides a window, but then still says when it gets really, really bad, we still need to shut everything down, because while these devices remove particulate, we really don't have a sense of how well they perform and how well they will perform in the long term. The other thing that the ordinance did is it appropriated $458,000 for a testing program. That's a lot of money, but keep in mind that it's a lot less money than it would be to send each of these retrofit control devices through a testing protocol with every single make and model. So we did have you know, a bit of a compromise in how we designed the testing program. What the borough is going to do is proceed with a competitive RFP to select one retrofit control device to expedite this process. Because typically, this burden should be on the manufacturers. This burden should not be with the borough and with the taxpayers to get this device in, but the borough recognized the need to get something accelerated and get it through the process, and that's the reason why the borough appropriated the funding, was to ensure that they would get at least one device through this program. And so there's going to be a competitive RFP to select which retrofit control device is going to go through the program. It could be an ESP, it could be a retrofit catalyst. We'll do that competitively. There'll be another RFP to select the laboratory that does the measurements. And then when it runs through, if the device meets the threshold for one of those categories, then it will be approved, and there will be an exemption to the curtailment program that allows folks to burn for extended periods of time. But I want to express that this doesn't end here. There are still some really big questions hanging out about retrofit control devices. And this is the biggest one. I think it was touched on you know, earlier as well in the presentations, that the known issue with wood stoves is they rely on the homeowner's expertise and willingness to operate it as efficiently as possible and burn only legal materials. And when these variables are not met, when they don't have the proper fuel, they don't have the proper device, or don't have the proper operations, the emissions are magnified exponentially. And the level of emissions really depends on every single homeowner's willingness and expertise. And if we put a retrofit control device on top of that, what it does is it amplifies all of those issues, because then these are not necessarily the easiest to operate and maintain, and it amplifies the homeowner's expertise and willingness that they have to know exactly how this thing operates and maintain it correctly on top of their stove. And so that's the biggest issue that we're dealing with, is how to ensure long-term performance of this so that it is a solution and it's not just something that we see as a silver bullet, but then it doesn't perform when it's out in the field. And so, and how am I doing on time? Okay. Well, I want to be done in 15 because of Glenn's. All right. Okay. All right. And so this technology is borrowed from the industrial sector. And the industrial sector is heavily regulated. It relies on testing, initial testing, and periodic requirements. Monitoring. They use parametric monitoring for devices like ESPs to monitor the primary voltage, secondary voltage, and the spark rate. When they see something out of the normal operating range, it actually triggers corrective action. These things there's records kept on them, and there's reporting done, and then they have periodic inspections where people from the government, in a capacity that I used to be in Wyoming, where we would go and we would sift through their records and look at everything and make sure that these devices were operating correctly. And it requires that level of oversight to ensure the greatest performance of these devices to get the 90% collection efficiency, that is that's being thrown out there. And also, it has federally enforceable permits. That's a lot of stuff. With residential sources, it's a different it's a different mentality with how to regulate residential sources. And think back to automobiles and vehicles. These are built, in automobiles and vehicles, the controls are built as an integral component with anti-defeat devices, so that the end user and the consumer has to do nothing except for turn the key and the device is operational. And those are the important things to actually ensure the long-term performance of these devices, because it's way too onerous to fall back on, you know, the monitoring and reporting on an individual residential basis. And so one of the questions that's come up is, you know, these have been implemented in Europe, so why can't we just implement them here? I mean, they work in Europe, why don't they work here? Big difference is the regulatory structure, and a quick case study in Zurich, Switzerland, where they have some of these devices installed, is that they have wood-firing devices with a rating from 0 to about 240,000 BTUs per hour, which would include a, you know, smaller hydronic heater. They have an annual inspection to verify, you know, proper device operation and use of clean, dry fuel. They've got an annual chimney sweep by a certified professional. All hydronic heating systems are subject to emission measurements every 2 years. So folks are going in and testing those with portable handheld devices and reporting back to the government. And then only dry and untreated wood may be burned, which is the same as it is here. But in case of doubt, the government officials have the authority to go in and collect an ash sample, have it analyzed by a laboratory, and judged by the authorities. And also in a lot of places in Europe, they have the ultimate authority to lock out and tag out a device and to stop it from being used. And so all of a sudden, when you look at, you know, how this is implemented in Europe, you realize that they took a lot of those pieces from the industrial sector and they did apply them to a you know, residential sector. And so, you know, I think one of the big questions you know, that we're posing to the stakeholders group, and that I would, you know, pose to members of the community is, you know, is this level of regulation acceptable in the community? If it is, we can move forward rather quickly with large-scale implementation and guaranteed results that are going to really help the community. But if it isn't, it's going to take us a little time to find where that happy medium is. And so that's why things take a little bit of time in the regulatory world. And the big takeaway from this is, you know, there is promise in this, but we can't just take technology from the industrial sector and pass it on to the residential sector without the accompanying monitoring, record keeping, and reporting, and expect it to have the same level of emission reductions. And I'm going to end on this slide, which this is not the first time that retrofit control devices have been experimented and tried up in Fairbanks. Several years ago, there was a substantial amount of money that was spent on retrofit catalysts. And where they fell short was in the long-term performance of these devices, with looking at the maintenance, looking at how they were sized and installed, and on what units they were installed. And there are none of these in operation today. And I think one of the worst missteps that we could take as the local lead on this is to, you know, invest a substantial portion of the community's funding into a technology that is not going to work in 3 to 5 years. And so we feel it's very prudent to take the time, even though it's painful to take that time right now, and it looks like we're not doing anything to get the implementation done, but it's very important to take the time to figure out exactly how effective these devices are and how the implementation is going to function before we start to spend a lot of resources. And that's what that's what the assembly took in the first step, is to look at the testing. And I do want to mention that the stakeholders group, I do want to thank, first of all of the members of the stakeholders group, because they have committed substantial amounts of time to understanding the complexities of this issue. And they are also looking at recommendations with how these devices, you know, can be installed and utilized you know, within the local control program, and how they can have benefits. And so it's very much alive. The discussions are very much there, and we are moving forward. It just has the appearance from the outside that we're not moving forward quickly when you don't see all the work behind the scenes. And with that, I believe I'm going to hand things off to Glenn Miller, and he's going to talk about the wood burning demo, which hopefully we'll be able to do, weather permitting.
Thanks, Lynette. Thanks, Nick. And I realize I'm standing in between you and lunch, so this is going to be brief. We had a planned demonstration for wood burning out in the parking lot this morning, and hopefully if the weather clears up, maybe we can do that this afternoon or even tomorrow. But the purpose of the demonstration was to emphasize the importance of dry wood. And this is something that we attempted to do in the last two conferences, just weren't able to get it together. So this year we made it happen, and Mother Nature did something to us. So we also, a side note on this, we learned a little bit more than what we thought we were going to when we were putting this together on installations that I'll share with you during the presentation. The borough-listed devices don't allow wood stoves to be installed if they're greater than 2.5 grams per hour. So something to keep in mind is when we see these stoves burning improperly, you know, that could put out a magnitude of 2 to 3 times greater than that. So, you know, much greater than the, you know, the emission ratings of these stoves, regardless of how good the stove is. And that, once again, comes back to the quality of the fuel that you're burning in the stove. And we've been working on this since 2010 is when this program began, and we started education outreach on the importance of dry wood and the split stack store program. And we'll continue to do that because it's really an important component of this. So you can see that on this photo here, this is the demonstration that we would like to do. Those two stoves are mounted on a trailer outside. Right now the stacks aren't on them, but if the weather clears up, we'll be able to complete that. So these stoves were Englander. They're 2.6 gram per hour stoves. They're both identical. They're both EPA certified stoves. The wood that we're using is white spruce, and you can see that the dry wood we're using was cut and split 3 years ago, 15% moisture content. The wet wood that we plan on using was cut in June, 29% moisture content. When you think about it, 29 doesn't sound too bad. I mean, the borough specifies 20% or less, so 9%, what difference could that make, right? So that's the wood that we're using for the wet wood. We also added thermocouples to the exhaust stream of the stoves right at the base of the stack, so we're measuring the output temperature of the stove. And this is really important because this is how you heat your house. The radiant heat that's coming off the stove is what you're using to heat the interior of your home. And less heat means less heat to your house. You're going to have to burn more wood to get the same amount of heat. So it's important to get those temperature readings also. And we did this earlier this week. So the graph that you see on that monitor there in the front basically tracks the temperature of the outlet temperature of each stove as we build the fire and add wood to it, and it would graph it over whatever period of time that we want to do so. So the stoves were lit. Both of them were lit with dry wood to establish a good coal bed, and both stoves were around 700 degrees before we added additional wood. So the stove on the left, we added 2 4-inch split pieces of spruce that were dry, and we did the same thing with the stove on the right. And you can see a difference, just by looking at the glass, you'll see the difference in the quality of the flame. One on the left, the glass is clean. The one on the right is already starting to get sooty. And within 6 minutes, you could see the difference here. If you look at the opacity, the stove on the left is the one with the dry wood. The one on the right has the 29% moist wood. And the other obvious thing is the temperature on the graph on the bottom. You can see that the temperature of the output of the stove is dropping significantly. After 25 minutes, the stove on the left was still at 610 degrees. The stove on the right, with the same white spruce, just 29% moist, was down to 384 degrees. And this graph shows the entire cycle. So these stoves were burned at a high rate, basically wide open for the entire time. And this is from, probably can't see it on the bottom left, but it was 11:15 a.m. is when we started the stoves. We established a good coal bed. About 20 minutes later is when we added the wood, and that's when you can see the significant drop. The difference in the graphs is the darker colored graph is the stove on the right with the wet wood. The lighter colored graph is the stove on the left with the dry wood. So you can see over that period of time, this is over about 2.5 hours, you can see how much more heat was derived from that stove that had the dry wood as opposed to the stove that had the wet wood. It just continued to drop. As that wet wood was added, it just continued to drop until both stoves were close to being burned out. There was still wood left in the firebox, but they were close to being burned out, and the ending time there was about 1:45. So it was about 2.5 hour period of time. But you can see how much more heat you got out of the stove just with that difference in dry wood versus wet wood. So lessons here are obvious. You know, dry wood works way better for opacity output. You get hardly any visible emissions if it's burning properly with dry wood. Wet wood, not so much. And, you know, once again, we talk about cutting wood early, storing it properly, and these are things that we've actually seen during our program. The difference in wood storage, good wood storage sheds with air circulation around it, water can't get to it, versus just piling it up on the ground and letting it rain and snow on it. And this is something that we learned as we were installing the stoves on the trailer and getting ready for the demonstration. These are actual photographs that were taken by air quality staff of appliances that were been changed out during the program. The photo on the left shows multiple appliances hooked into one stack, which is a big no-no. And on the right, you have some type of a barrel that was turned into a stack robber, which is designed to extract heat from the stack. And both of these scenarios really affect the draft significantly on the stove. And this is something that has been talked about a number of times, where you need, with the installation of the stove, you need the proper stack height. And Kent Severinsen from the Woodway used to be on our commission. He talked about this extensively. We hear it. I guess we didn't hear it enough, because I'm going to go back to the first slide that we had. When we were putting these stoves on the trailer for demonstration, air quality staff went out and purchased some stack, and they were the insulated stack, but we needed an adapter to attach it to the stove. And so the air quality staff told me, you know, these pieces of insulated stack were over $200 a piece. And I said, well, the heck with that. Let's just go get some cheap stuff. Just go get the click together uninsulated stuff, and we'll put it on there. It's just for demonstration anyway. You know, why spend all that money? So they went and did that. And We installed that on that stove at about 4 to 6 feet high, lit the stoves up, got them going real good with the dry wood, closed the doors, both of them just smoking like heck. Couldn't figure it out. And so Nick come out and he got the instruction book from the installation out of the trash, because that's what guys do, right? We throw the instructions in the trash and we just put stuff together. So Nick pulls it out and he reads, he says, hey, this thing needs a minimum of 15 feet of insulated stack. Oh, okay, well, I guess we'll use the insulated stack. So we went, reconfigured it, put the insulated stack on there. Obviously 15 foot wasn't practical to put on this trailer, but after we added that insulated stack, it was amazing how much better that stove performed just by having the proper draft, because that's the air intake for that stove. If you don't have the proper draft, you're not having the proper amount of air come in, you get a rich mixture, you'll get smoke. So the installation is equally important to the fuel that you're burning in the stove on top of the type of stove. So you have three things that really need to work in concert for the stove to be operating properly. And that's the end of my presentation, and hopefully this afternoon the weather will improve. We'll be able to actually show this demonstration to you, because it really is interesting to see the difference in opacity on top of the amount of heat output that it graphs for you. And you can see that you know, just by looking at the chart of how much heat you're getting out of your stove. And everyone here, we talked about, we're doing this for reasons of economy. We want to save money. Well, we don't want to burn any more wood that we don't have to. At the same time, we get cleaner air when we burn good wood, good appliance with a proper installation. So thank you for your time, and I think we're getting close to lunch.
Okay. Well, thank you, Glenn and Nick. And, you know, leave it to Nick, old reliable Nick, to pull the darn instructions out and read them. What an engineer he is, right? So, okay, so it's time for lunch. And if you know where the gazebo room, it's kind of down the hall, out here down the hall to my right. We have a buffet lunch. I think we're having some lasagna, some garlic bread, green salad. Sounds really yummy. If the weather's permitting, Glenn's going to fire up that burn demo. I'm not sure. I haven't peeked out the window yet, but we're going to get that started here hopefully pretty soon. We're going to meet back here at 1:15. So if you need to run errands, you want to hang out and visit with friends, that's fine. And our next speaker will be Dan Britton from the Interior Gas Utility to give us an update on that. So without further ado, it is lunchtime. We'll see you. So I don't want people seeing my email. So I moved it to... No.